not stand under his own power. This is the fact that every encounter with Baron Vladimir Harkonnen began with the physical reality that preceded every political calculation and every act of cruelty and every strategic maneuver that the most feared man in the Landsraad executed across decades of ruthless governance. Before the intelligence, before the cunning, before the wealth that exceeded what most planetary economies generated, and the network of spies that penetrated every institution in the known universe. Before any of it, there was the body. The Baron weighed approximately 200 standard kilograms. Not through the ordinary mechanism of excessive consumption that produced obesity in most human beings, not through the simple accumulation of adipose tissue that an undisciplined relationship with food created over years of overindulgence, through disease, through a condition that had been given to him deliberately by a woman whose training made her capable of biological interventions that the Imperium's medical establishment could not detect and could not reverse, as the consequence of an encounter that the Baron had initiated and that the woman had endured, and that the disease was the response to. The disease was a Bene Gesserit weapon, not a weapon in the conventional sense, not a poison, not a pathogen, not a compound that could be identified and counteracted through the ordinary mechanisms of pharmacological defense. A biological alteration initiated through the Bene Gesserit's mastery of their own biochemistry and transmitted through physical contact that changed the Baron's metabolic functioning at a level so fundamental that the change was irreversible by any medical technology the Imperium possessed. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam was the woman who gave it to him. The circumstances of the giving were the circumstances that made the giving a response rather than an attack. The Baron had assaulted her, had forced himself upon her in an act of sexual violence that the Bene Gesserit's institutional records documented with the dispassionate precision that the sisterhood brought to all matters of consequence to the breeding program. The assault had occurred in the context of the breeding program's management of the Harkonnen genetic line. The Bene Gesserit had required a child from the Baron's genetics, and the Baron's cooperation had been secured through arrangements that the Baron had then violated by taking from Mohiam what the arrangement had not offered. Mohiam's response was biological. The Prana Bindu disciplines gave a trained Bene Gesserit the capacity for interventions in biological systems, her own and under the right conditions others, that the Imperium's medical science could not replicate or detect. What Mohiam did to the Baron's metabolic system was an act of that capacity, a modification transmitted through the physical contact that the assault provided, that altered the Baron's body's relationship with its own fat storage in a way that no subsequent medical intervention could correct. The modification was progressive. It did not produce the Baron's eventual condition immediately. The 200-kilogram mass was not the result of a single biological event, but of a sustained metabolic dysfunction that accumulated its effects across years, that the Baron's physicians could observe but could not reverse, that the Baron himself experienced as the slow, inexorable betrayal of a body that had once been, and this is the detail that the mythology sometimes obscures, impressive. The Baron had been, before the disease, a physically commanding man, not obese, not even heavy, not even... The accounts that survive from the period before the metabolic alteration describe a man whose physical presence was a political asset, tall, well-built, carrying himself with the confidence that physical capability provided to a person who operated in the political landscape of the Landsraad, where physical presence was not simply a personal quality, but a signal of the genetic vitality that the noble houses valued and cultivated. The disease took this from him. Slowly, across years that the Baron experienced as the progressive loss of the physical identity that had been part of how he understood himself in the world. The weight accumulated, the mobility decreased, the body that had been an asset became a liability, a visible, public, impossible to conceal demonstration that something was wrong with the head of House Harkonnen, that the man who governed one of the wealthiest and most powerful houses in the Landsraad was unable to manage the most basic dimension of human existence, the maintenance of his own physical form. The suspensor belt was the technological solution that the Baron adopted to manage the condition the disease had produced, and the belt was itself a political statement as much as a medical device. Suspensor technology was not new. The Imperium's engineering traditions had developed suspensors, devices that used the Holtzman effect to nullify gravity's pull on the objects they were attached to. For a range of applications, from industrial lifting to military equipment to the transportation of heavy goods, the technology was reliable, well understood, and available to anyone with the economic resources to acquire it. What was unusual was the application, using suspensor technology to support a human body, to carry the weight that the body's own musculature could no longer manage, was not a standard medical application. It was, in the context of the Imperium's cultural attitudes toward physical capability and genetic fitness, an admission that the body had failed, that the person wearing the belt was unable to perform the most basic function of a human organism, the support of its own weight against gravity, and that the failure was being managed through technology rather than being corrected through the medical or genetic interventions that the noble house's culture preferred. The Baron wore the belt openly, not because he had no choice. The belt could have been concealed beneath clothing, could have been managed with the discretion that the Imperium's political culture would have understood and accommodated. He wore it openly because the openness was a choice, a statement, a deliberate presentation of the body's condition as something that the Baron was not ashamed of, and that anyone who encountered him would have to deal with directly rather than being permitted to pretend it was not there. This openness was characteristic of the Baron's approach to power. The Harkonnen style, the institutional culture that the Baron had inherited and had refined into an art form across decades of governance, was directness. Not the directness of the Atreides, which was grounded in principle and expressed through straightforward dealing. The directness of confrontation, the willingness to place uncomfortable realities in front of the people the Baron was dealing with, and to observe their responses, to use those responses as information about the people producing them, to make the discomfort itself a tool of the political management the Baron was conducting. The body in the suspensor belt was uncomfortable to look at. The Baron knew this. The 200 kilograms of flesh, suspended by the belt's gravitational nullification, moved in ways that the ordinary experience of heavy bodies did not prepare the observer for. The mass was there, was visible, was clearly enormous, but it floated rather than pressed, drifted rather than settled. Occupied space with the strange lightness that the suspensor effect produced in objects that were heavy but weightless. The visual dissonance, the expectation of heaviness contradicted by the reality of flotation, was unsettling, and the Baron used the unsettlement as deliberately as he used any other tool in his considerable arsenal. Visitors to the Harkonnen headquarters on Giedi Prime encountered the Baron's body before they encountered the Baron's mind, and the encounter was managed. The Baron arranged his physical presentations, the audiences, the meetings, the social occasions at which he received the people whose management his governance required, with attention to the body's impact on the people who were seeing it. He positioned himself. He moved in ways that emphasized the body's scale. He used the suspensor belt's capabilities to produce movements that the visitor's experience of normal human bodies did not prepare them for, rising without effort, drifting laterally rather than walking, hovering at heights that placed his face above the visitors despite the body's inability to stand. The physical performance was deliberate. The Baron was not simply coping with a disability, he was weaponizing it, converting the body's grotesque condition into a tool of intimidation, converting the disease's consequences into a political advantage, taking the thing that the Bene Gesserit's assault had done to him and making it serve his purposes rather than simply enduring it as a burden. The medical dimension of the Baron's condition deserves sustained attention because the condition was not simply obesity, and because the distinction between what the Baron had and what obesity was matters for understanding both the Baron's experience and the Bene Gesserit's capability. Ordinary obesity, the accumulation of adipose tissue through caloric surplus, was a condition the Imperium's medical technology could manage. The noble house's access to sophisticated medical care, including the genetic optimization that the Suk medical tradition provided, meant that ordinary metabolic disorders were treatable with a reliability that made their persistence unusual in the Imperium's upper social strata. A Landsraad noble who was simply overeating could have the condition corrected through medical intervention, and the persistence of obesity in a noble family would have been interpreted as either a failure of the family's medical establishment or a deliberate choice. The Baron's condition was neither of these things. It was a metabolic dysfunction that operated at a level below the Imperium's standard medical technology's capacity to intervene, a change in the body's fundamental metabolic programming that could not be detected as a foreign alteration, because it was now part of the body's own operating system, incorporated into the metabolic processes as if it were native rather than introduced. The Baron's physicians could see the effects, the progressive weight gain, the metabolic markers that indicated the dysfunction's operation. But they could not identify the cause, because the cause was an alteration so deeply integrated into the body's biochemistry that it was indistinguishable from the body's own metabolism. This was the Bene Gesserit capability at its most disturbing, the capacity to alter another person's biology at such a fundamental level that the alteration became invisible, undetectable, indistinguishable from the natural. Not a poison that could be identified and counteracted, not a disease that could be diagnosed and treated, a change in what the body was rather than in what was being done to the body. The Baron's physicians searched for the cause for years. The Harkonnen house employed some of the Imperium's most capable medical practitioners. The wealth of House Harkonnen could purchase expertise that exceeded what most noble houses could access. And the Baron's personal investment in finding a solution to his condition motivated the kind of sustained, well-funded medical investigation that produced results when results were available to be produced. The investigation produced no results. The cause remained invisible. The effects continued to accumulate. The Baron's experience of the disease was the experience of progressive loss. Not the acute loss of a catastrophic medical event, not the sudden deprivation of capability that a stroke or a severe injury produced. The gradual, cumulative, year-over-year loss of the physical capability that the body's increasing mass imposed. The loss of the ability to walk without assistance. The loss of the ability to stand without the suspensor belt's support. The loss of the physical independence that most human beings took for granted as a baseline condition of their existence. The loss was accompanied by the awareness, the Baron was too intelligent to lack the awareness, that the loss was visible, that every person who encountered him could see what the disease was doing, that the political landscape in which he operated included, as a permanent feature, the visual evidence of the Baron's body's failure. The Landsraad's noble houses cultivated physical excellence as a marker of genetic fitness. The Baron's condition was the opposite of physical excellence, and the opposition was on display at every political encounter, every diplomatic meeting, every public appearance. The Baron's response to this visibility was not concealment or apology. It was aggression. The body's condition became, in the Baron's management of it, a component of the fear that the Harkonnen name was associated with, an additional element of the menace that the Baron projected in every interaction, an additional source of the discomfort that the Baron deliberately produced in the people he was managing. The body was grotesque. The Baron made the grotesqueness work for him, converting it from a vulnerability into a dimension of the intimidation that was the Harkonnen style's primary tool. This conversion from vulnerability to weapon was one of the Baron's most characteristic acts of political management, and it revealed something important about the quality of his intelligence. A lesser mind would have been diminished by the body's condition, would have retreated from public visibility, would have managed the condition through concealment and compensation, would have allowed the disease to reduce the political effectiveness that the physical presentation contributed to. The Baron's mind was not lesser. It assessed the condition, identified its potential utility, and deployed the utility with the same strategic precision that characterized every other element of the Harkonnen political operation. The political implications of the Baron's body extended beyond the immediate dynamics of intimidation and into the deeper structure of the Imperium's political culture. The Landsraad valued genetic fitness. This was not simply an aesthetic preference. The noble house's culture was organized around the principle that physical capability reflected genetic quality, and genetic quality was the foundation of the house's claims to their positions. The breeding programs that the houses maintained, the physical training that the house's members underwent, the attention to physical presentation that the house's political culture demanded, all of this reflected a civilization that took the body's condition as evidence of the person's fitness to govern, to lead, to make the decisions that governance and leadership required. The Baron's body violated every element of this cultural framework. He was not physically capable. He was not genetically fit in the visible sense that the Landsraad's culture valued. His body did not present the evidence of health and capability and genetic quality that the noble house's political culture expected from its leaders. By every measure that the Landsraad's culture applied to the assessment of a leader's physical fitness, the Baron failed. And yet, he governed. He governed with an effectiveness that exceeded what most of the Landsraad's physically fit leaders achieved. He managed the most productive spice harvesting operation in the Imperium's history. He maintained a political network that penetrated every significant institution in the known universe. He executed the most consequential military conspiracy of his era, the destruction of House Atreides, with a precision that demonstrated strategic capability of the highest order. He did all of this from a body that could not stand under its own power. The contradiction between the body and the capability was, for the Imperium's political observers, disturbing in a way that exceeded the discomfort of the body's visual impact. The Baron's success demonstrated that the cultural framework was wrong, that the connection between physical fitness and governance capability that the Landsraad's culture assumed was not reliable, that a person whose body was by every visible measure failing could be, in the dimensions that actually mattered for governance, among the most capable operators in the known universe. This demonstration was not lost on the Baron's enemies. The Atreides, whose political culture was organized around a different set of principles, assessed the Baron's capability without regard to his body's condition. Tufir Hawat's analysis of the Harkonnen threat was based on the Baron's strategic intelligence rather than on his physical condition. and the analysis concluded that the Baron was among the most dangerous political actors in the Imperium, regardless of what his body looked like. The Bene Gesserit's assessment was similarly clear-eyed. The Sisterhood's analysis of the Baron was not distracted by the body's condition. The Bene Gesserit understood, better than anyone, that the body's condition was the product of their own intervention rather than of the Baron's genetic quality or personal discipline. The Sisterhood assessed the Baron's intelligence, his strategic capability, his willingness to use violence in service of his objectives, and concluded that the man inside the failing body was formidable in every dimension that the body's condition did not directly affect. The Baron's relationship with pleasure was the dimension of his embodiment that the texts address most directly, and that the popular understanding of the character most frequently oversimplifies. The simplification is this: the Baron was a hedonist. He pursued pleasure, physical pleasure, sensory pleasure, the pleasure of indulgence and excess, with an appetite that matched his body's scale. He was gluttonous, self-indulgent, consumed by the appetites that his wealth and power gave him the capacity to satisfy without constraint. This reading of the Baron's relationship with pleasure is not wrong in its details, but is wrong in its emphasis. It presents the pursuit of pleasure as the Baron's primary motivation, as the thing that drove his behavior and explained his choices. The texts do not support this reading. The Baron's relationship with pleasure was real. He did pursue sensory satisfaction, did enjoy food and drink, and the physical experiences that his wealth provided access to. But the pursuit was not the driving force. The driving force was power. The pleasure was a consequence of the power rather than the purpose of it. A thing the Baron permitted himself because the power made it available, not a thing the Baron pursued the power in order to obtain. This distinction matters because it affects the assessment of what the Baron was. A hedonist, a person driven primarily by the pursuit of pleasure, is a predictable figure, manageable through the exploitation of the appetites that drive the behavior. A power seeker who also enjoys pleasure is a different and more dangerous figure, less predictable, less manageable, less likely to be controlled through the provision or denial of the pleasures that the hedonist reading would suggest are the primary lever of influence. The Baron was the second figure. His strategic decisions were not made in service of his pleasures. They were made in service of his power, the accumulation and maintenance and deployment of political, economic, and military capability that constituted the Harkonnen House's institutional position. The pleasures were enjoyed along the way. They were not the destination. The cruelty was part of this pattern. The Baron's treatment of the people under his authority, the violence, the exploitation, the deliberate infliction of suffering that the texts document with the specificity that the narrative requires, was not the expression of sadistic pleasure, or not primarily. It was the expression of power. The Baron hurt people because hurting people demonstrated power, because the capacity to inflict suffering without consequence was the most direct evidence of the power's completeness. Because the political culture of the Imperium, and the Harkonnen institutional culture in particular, used the willingness to inflict suffering as a measure of the ruler's authority. The body complicated this pattern in ways that the Baron understood and managed. A person whose body was failing, who could not stand without technological assistance, who was visibly dependent on a device for the most basic physical function, had to demonstrate power more aggressively than a person whose body communicated power through its own physical presence. The Atreides Duke could demonstrate authority through his bearing, his physical confidence, the unspoken communication of a body that was capable and controlled. The Baron could not. The Baron's body communicated failure, and the communication had to be overcome through other means. through the demonstrations of power that made the body's condition irrelevant, through the exercises of authority that were so complete and so unrestrained that the observer's attention was redirected from the body to the power the body was exercising. The cruelty was, in part, this redirection. The Baron's willingness to be cruel in the presence of the people he was governing was a statement that the body's condition did not diminish the authority, that the authority was so complete that it could express itself in the most extreme forms regardless of the body from which it was being expressed. The cruelty said, "Do not mistake the body for the person. The person is the one who is doing this to you, and the person's capability is not limited by the body you are looking at." Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, the Baron's nephew, the young man being groomed as the Baron's political heir, was the body that the Baron could not have. This is the reading that the texts support through the sustained attention the Baron gives to Feyd's physical development and presentation, and it illuminates something important about the Baron's relationship with his own embodiment. Feyd was beautiful, not simply healthy or fit or physically capable, beautiful, in the way that the Imperium's cultural aesthetics defined beauty, lean, muscular, symmetrically proportioned, carrying himself with the physical confidence that a trained body in its prime could provide. Feyd's body was the advertisement for the Harkonnen genetics that the Baron's body could not be, the visible evidence that the Harkonnen line produced physical excellence, that the Baron's condition was an aberration rather than a genetic inevitability, that the house's biological future was represented by the nephew's beauty rather than by the uncle's grotesqueness. The Baron's attention to Feyd's physical presentation was more than an uncle's pride in a promising nephew. It was the management of the political narrative that the Baron's own body complicated. Every public appearance that Feyd made, every arena combat, every political presentation, every occasion at which the Harkonnen heir was displayed to the Imperium's political audience was a counter-argument to what the Baron's body communicated. The Baron was this. The heir would be that. The house's future would be different from the house's present, and the difference was visible in the heir's body. The Baron groomed Feyd with an intensity that reflected this investment in the heir's representational function. The grooming was political rather than personal. The Baron was not primarily interested in Feyd as a person, but in Feyd as a political instrument. A body that could do what the Baron's body could not, a physical presence that could communicate the things about the Harkonnen house that the Baron's own physical presence contradicted. Rabban, the Baron's other nephew, Glossu Rabban, the Beast, served a different function. Where Feyd was the display model, the advertisement for the Harkonnen genetic potential, Rabban was the tool, the blunt instrument of governance that the Baron deployed to Arrakis to manage the spice operation through the direct application of force that the operation's scale and the Fremen's resistance required. Rabban's body was large, powerful, built for the physical assertion of authority that his role demanded. It was not beautiful. It was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to be threatening, and the threat was the thing the Baron needed from the nephew who would govern in the Baron's absence. The two nephews, Feyd the heir and Rabban the tool, represented the two dimensions of the Baron's relationship with the physical. Feyd was what the Baron wanted to be, or wanted the house to be represented by, the political body, the presented self, the visible expression of genetic quality that the Landsraad's culture valued. Rabban was what the Baron needed to be, the functional body, the instrument of governance, the physical capacity for the application of force that the political landscape required. The Baron, in his suspensor belt, was the mind that directed both, from a body that could perform neither function. The genetic dimension of the Baron's body, the bloodline that the body carried. The heritage that the body's genetics encoded is the dimension that connects the Baron's physical story to the broader narrative of the Dune saga in its most consequential form. The Baron was Jessica's father. This fact, revealed through the Bene Gesserit's breeding program records and confirmed through the genetic analysis that the saga's later events made available, reframes the entire Harkonnen-Atreides conflict in terms that the conflict's participants did not fully understand while they were fighting it. Jessica was the product of the Bene Gesserit's management of the Harkonnen genetic line. The sisterhood had required genetic material from the Baron, had arranged, through the breeding program's mechanisms, for the production of a child carrying the Baron's genetics. The child was Jessica. She was placed, as the breeding program's design required, with Duke Leto Atreides of Caladan, carrying the Harkonnen genetics into the Atreides line for the combination that the breeding program's long-term objectives required. Jessica did not know her parentage. The Bene Gesserit's management of the breeding program included the concealment of the genetic relationships that the program produced. The placed women did not typically know whose genetics they carried, because the knowledge would have complicated the placement's political dimensions, and because the sisterhood's institutional interest in maintaining control of the genetic information exceeded the individual's interest in knowing her own heritage. The Baron did not know that Jessica was his daughter. The genetic material that had produced her had been obtained through the encounter with Mohiam, the same encounter that had produced the disease, and the sisterhood's management of the product had not included the Baron's informed consent or his knowledge of the result. The Baron knew that the encounter had occurred. He did not know that the encounter had produced a child, or that the child had been placed with the Atreides, or that the child was the mother of the boy who would destroy everything the Baron had built. Paul Atreides was the Baron's grandson. This is the fact that the genetic revelation produces, the connection that the breeding program's management had created, and that the political conflict between the houses had obscured. The boy whom the Baron had tried to kill, the Atreides heir whose destruction the Harkonnen conspiracy had been designed to accomplish, carried the Baron's own genetics, was the product of the Baron's own bloodline combined with the Atreides line through the Bene Gesserit's deliberate arrangement. The irony is not simple. It is structural, built into the architecture of the saga's genetic narrative, reflecting the Bene Gesserit's management of the human gene pool in ways that the managed subjects did not understand. The Baron was trying to destroy his own grandson. The Baron's genetics were being carried by the house the Baron was at war with. The conflict between the Harkonnens and the Atreides was, at the genetic level, a conflict within a single family. A family whose members did not know they were family, whose enmity was being managed by an institution that understood the genetic connections and that had created them for purposes that neither house understood. The children of Dune, Leto II and Ganima, Paul's twins, carried the Baron's genetics as well. The God Emperor, who would govern the known universe for 3,500 years, was the Baron's great-grandson. The genetic line that the Baron had spent his life building the Harkonnen house's power to protect and perpetuate was being perpetuated, not through the Harkonnen house, which was destroyed at Arrakis, but through the Atreides line that the Baron had tried to destroy, and that was carrying his genetics into the most consequential biological future the species would produce. The Baron's body, the failing, disease-ridden, suspensor-supported body, carried the genetics that would eventually produce the most powerful single being in human history. The body that could not stand under its own power contained the genetic material that would, through the Bene Gesserit's management and Jessica's rebellion, produce the Kwisatz Haderach and the God Emperor. The grotesque flesh was the vessel for a genetic heritage of extraordinary consequence. This juxtaposition, the body's external degradation and the genetic's internal significance, is one of the saga's most sustained examinations of the relationship between the visible and the essential, between what a person appears to be and what a person actually carries. The Baron's mind was what made the body's condition a matter of political consequence rather than simply medical interest. A lesser intelligence in the Baron's body would have been a tragic figure. A man whose physical condition prevented him from exercising the capabilities he possessed, whose governance was limited by the body's limitations, whose political effectiveness was diminished by the visible evidence of the body's failure. The Baron was not a tragic figure. He was a terrifying one. The mind that inhabited the failing body was among the most dangerous minds in the Imperium, and the combination of the dangerous mind and the failing body produced something that the political landscape found more disturbing than either element alone. The Baron thought clearly. This is the quality that the body's condition sometimes obscured in the perception of people who encountered him for the first time. The assumption that a body so visibly failing must house a mind that was similarly diminished, that the physical grotesqueness reflected some corresponding mental decline. The assumption was catastrophically wrong. The Baron's strategic thinking was as precise and as ruthless as any in the Landsraad. His assessment of political situations was informed by an intelligence network that he had built and maintained, and that provided him with information of a quality that the Imperium's other political actors could not match. His capacity for long-range planning, the ability to set objectives that would take years to achieve and to maintain the sustained effort that the achievement required, was demonstrated by the Arrakis conspiracy, which was years in the planning and which succeeded in its immediate objectives with a precision that reflected the quality of the mind that had designed it. The conspiracy itself, the plot to destroy House Atreides through the Emperor's complicity and the Sardakar's disguised participation, was the Baron's masterwork. The plan required the management of multiple actors with conflicting interests. The Emperor, whose political motives for wanting the Atreides weakened were different from the Baron's, the Sardakar, whose deployment in Harkonnen livery required the Emperor's authorization and the military's cooperation, the traitor within the Atreides household, Wellington Ewer, the Sook doctor whose conditioning the Baron's operatives had found a way to compromise, the timing, which had to coordinate the military assault with the betrayal from within, the political cover, which had to make the destruction of the Atreides look like a consequence of the Arrakis assignment's inherent dangers rather than a deliberate conspiracy. The Baron managed all of this from a body that floated in a suspensor belt. The management was conducted through the communication channels and the personal meetings that the Baron's political operation required, from a physical position that would have been laughable if the person occupying it had been less capable. The Baron received his agents, his military commanders, his intelligence operatives, from a body that hovered rather than stood, that drifted rather than walked, that occupied the meeting space with the strange, unsettling presence that the suspensor-supported mass produced. And the people who were received, the agents, the commanders, the operatives, were not laughing. They were afraid. The body was grotesque. The mind was lethal. The combination was more frightening than either element alone. The planning of the Arrakis assault revealed the Baron's strategic thinking at its most developed, and examining it illuminates the quality of the intelligence that the failing body contained. The Baron understood that the Atreides transfer to Arrakis was a political trap, that the Emperor was using the assignment to place the Atreides in a position where they could be destroyed without the political consequences that the destruction of a popular Landsraad house would normally produce. The Baron understood this because the Baron had suggested it. The transfer was the Baron's proposal, advanced to the Emperor through the political channels that the Harkonnen imperial relationship maintained, designed to create the conditions under which the Atreides' destruction could be accomplished, with the Emperor's cooperation and the Landsraad's acquiescence. The proposal required the Baron to give up Arrakis, to relinquish the spice harvesting operation that was the Harkonnen house's primary revenue source, the economic foundation of the Harkonnen political position. This was a sacrifice that most political operators would have been unwilling to make, because the sacrifice was immediate and visible and the recovery was uncertain. The Baron made it because the strategic calculation supported it. The short-term loss of the Arrakis revenue was acceptable if the long-term gain, the destruction of the Atreides and the subsequent recovery of Arrakis, was sufficiently probable and sufficiently valuable. The Baron's willingness to make this sacrifice, to accept a significant short-term cost in service of a larger strategic objective, was the quality that distinguished his intelligence from the more common form of political thinking that the Landsraad's lesser houses practiced. Lesser operators thought in terms of immediate advantage and immediate cost. The Baron thought in terms of position, the arrangement of political, military and economic assets that would produce the conditions for future advantage, even when the arrangement required the acceptance of present disadvantage. This positional thinking was the Baron's greatest strength and the quality that made him dangerous on a scale that the body's condition could not diminish. The body could not stand. The mind could think 3 moves ahead of the Imperium's best political operators and could execute the plans that the thinking produced with a precision that the body's condition did not affect. Giedi Prime, the Harkonnen homeworld, was, in a meaningful sense, an extension of the Baron's body. Not metaphorically, or not only metaphorically. The planet's character reflected the Baron's governance in the same way that a household reflected its master's personality, scaled up to the planetary level that the Harkonnen wealth and power operated at. Giedi Prime was industrial. The planet's economy was organized around manufacturing and extraction, the production of goods and the harvesting of resources at scales that made the planet one of the Imperium's most productive economic units. The production was not clean. The planet's environment bore the marks of the exploitation that the economy imposed, polluted, degraded. Bearing the visible consequences of an industrial operation that prioritized output over sustainability, that treated the environment as a resource to be consumed rather than a system to be maintained. This was the Baron's approach to governance applied to the planetary scale. The Baron treated the things under his authority, the people, the resources, the institutions, the environment, as materials to be used in service of the Harkonnen house's objectives. The use was not careful. The use was not sustainable. The use was not concerned with the long-term consequences of the exploitation. Because the Baron's planning horizon, while strategically long, was operationally short, the immediate advantage of the exploitation outweighed the distant cost of the depletion in the Baron's calculation. Because the immediate advantage was certain, and the distant cost was uncertain, and the calculus of certainty versus uncertainty consistently favoured the immediate. The people of Giedi Prime were the most visible expression of this governance philosophy. The population was managed as a labour force rather than as a citizenry. The distinction mattered because the management of a labour force was organised around the extraction of productivity, while the management of a citizenry was organised around the provision of conditions under which the citizens could thrive. The Baron's governance provided conditions under which the population could produce, and the conditions under which the population might thrive were not part of the calculation. The gladiatorial arenas were the population's entertainment and the Baron's political tool. The arenas provided the population with the cathartic violence that the Harkonnen governance style used as a substitute for the political participation that other governance traditions provided. The population could not participate in governance. The Harkonnen system did not include the mechanisms for popular input that some of the Imperium's more progressive houses maintained. The population could watch people fight to the death, and the watching was designed to provide the emotional release that the absence of political participation would otherwise have produced as unrest. Feyd-Rautha's arena fights were the most politically consequential expression of this system. The Baron's heir, the beautiful body that would represent the Harkonnen future, was presented to the population in the arena, fighting opponents whose selection and condition were managed to produce the outcomes the Baron's political narrative required. Feyd fought. Feyd won. The population saw the heir's physical capability and was intended to conclude that the house's future was in capable hands. The management of the arena fights, the behind-the-scenes manipulation that ensured the outcomes the Baron needed, was another expression of the quality of the Baron's thinking. The fights appeared fair. They were not. The opponents were drugged, or weakened, or otherwise compromised in ways that the audience could not detect, ensuring that Feyd's victories were sufficiently dramatic to impress the audience while being sufficiently assured to protect the investment that the Baron had made in the heir's survival and reputation. Feyd eventually discovered the manipulation and deviated from the plan, fought an opponent who had not been compromised, risking the outcome that the Baron's management was designed to prevent. This deviation was, in the Baron's assessment, evidence that Feyd was developing the independent judgment that a future ruler would need, and evidence that the management of Feyd would need to be more sophisticated than the management of the arena fights had been. The Baron's network of intelligence and control extended far beyond Giedi Prime, and the network's scope revealed the scale of the operation that the mind inside the failing body was managing. The Harkonnen intelligence apparatus was one of the Imperium's most capable, a network of agents, informants, and operatives that penetrated the political and economic institutions of the known universe with a thoroughness that reflected decades of sustained institutional investment. The Baron had built this network not through the recruitment of ideologically motivated agents. The Harkonnen house did not inspire loyalty in the way that the Atreides did, but through the application of the tools that the Harkonnen governance style favoured: bribery, blackmail, the exploitation of vulnerabilities, the creation of obligations that the obligated could not refuse without consequences that exceeded what the refusal was worth. The network provided the Baron with information that made his strategic planning possible. The conspiracy against the Atreides was built on intelligence, on the detailed knowledge of the Atreides household's internal dynamics, of the Emperor's political calculations, of the Sardaukars' deployment capabilities, of the Fremen's strength and distribution on Arrakis. This intelligence was not available through public channels. It was the product of the network's sustained penetration of the institutions that possessed the information, obtained through the methods that the Harkonnen operational culture had refined across generations. Thufi Hawat, the Atreides Mentat, one of the most capable intelligence analysts in the Imperium, was the person whose capture by the Harkonnens revealed the most about the Baron's relationship with intelligence and capability. The Baron kept Hawat alive. This decision to maintain the enemy's mentat rather than executing him, to invest in the management of a captured intelligence asset rather than eliminating a potential threat, was characteristic of the Baron's approach to capability. The Baron valued capability wherever he found it, including in his enemies, and the Baron's willingness to invest in the management of captured capability rather than destroying it was one of the qualities that made his political operation more sophisticated than the Imperium's simpler power structures. Hawat was managed through the administration of a poison, a slow-acting toxin whose antidote the Baron controlled, creating a dependency that kept the Mentat alive and functional while ensuring that the Mentat's service was compelled rather than voluntary. The management was not elegant. It was effective. Hawat's analytical capability was deployed in the Harkonnen interest, and the deployment provided the Baron with a quality of strategic analysis that the Harkonnen House's own Mentat, Peter de Vries, whose capabilities were considerable but whose stability was compromised by his addiction and his appetites, could not match. The Baron's management of Hawat revealed the relationship between the Baron's body and the Baron's approach to other people's bodies. Both were instruments. The Baron's own body was an instrument that the disease had compromised, and that the suspensor belt and the political management had partially compensated for. Other people's bodies, Hawat's, Fade's, Rabban's, the bodies of the people who populated the Harkonnen governance apparatus, were instruments that the Baron deployed toward the objectives that his mind had determined were desirable. The deployment was not sentimental. The instruments were used, and the using was calibrated to the instrument's capability rather than to the instrument's comfort. Peter de Vries, the Harkonnen Mentat, whose twisted capabilities served the Baron's intelligence operation, was another expression of this instrumentalist approach. De Vries was brilliant. De Vries was also unstable. The Mentat's capabilities were augmented by the sapho juice that enhanced cognitive function, and the augmentation had produced side effects that included a sadistic appetite that the Baron both exploited and managed. The Baron used de Vries's capabilities while managing de Vries's instabilities, extracting the analytical value while containing the damage that the instabilities could produce. The relationship between the Baron and his Mentat was the relationship between a user and a tool whose capabilities were valued and whose limitations were managed, and whose maintenance was justified by the tool's productivity rather than by any regard for the tool's well-being. De Vries served until de Vries was no longer useful. The same calculus applied to every person in the Baron's orbit. They served the Baron's purposes, and their continued participation in the Baron's operation was contingent on their continued utility. The Baron's sexuality is the dimension of his embodiment that the texts address most carefully, and that the discussion of the character must handle with equal care. The Baron was attracted to young men. The texts document this attraction in the context of the Harkonnen court's operations, where the Baron's sexual preferences were accommodated through the procurement of partners whose youth was part of what the Baron was attracted to, and whose participation was not voluntary in any meaningful sense. The procurement was managed by the Harkonnen household staff, who provided the Baron with the partners the Baron's preferences required, and the provision was conducted with the matter-of-fact efficiency that characterized the Harkonnen operations' approach to every other dimension of the Baron's needs. The texts present this dimension of the Baron's character within the context of the Harkonnen governance style's treatment of the people under its authority. The Baron used people. He used them for labor, for combat, for political purposes, for intelligence, and for sexual gratification. The using was not distinguished by the purpose, the labor, and the combat, and the politics, and the sex were all expressions of the same fundamental relationship between the Baron and the people he governed, in which the people were instruments, and the Baron was the instrumentalist. The coercion involved in the Baron's sexual relationships was the coercion that characterized every dimension of the Harkonnen governance, the exercise of power without the consent of the people over whom the power was exercised, the treatment of other people's bodies and other people's autonomy as resources to be deployed rather than as rights to be respected. The sexual exploitation was not separate from the political exploitation. It was the same exploitation, expressed in the intimate dimension rather than the political one. The body's condition added a dimension to this exploitation that the texts handle with specific attention. The Baron's sexual encounters occurred in the context of the body, the 200 kilograms, the suspensor belt, the mass that hovered and drifted and occupied space in ways that the ordinary experience of human bodies did not prepare for. The encounters were, for the Baron's partners, encounters with the body as well as with the power, and the body's condition was part of what made the encounters expressions of power rather than expressions of desire. The Baron could have what he wanted regardless of what the body looked like, because the power that the body carried, the political authority, the economic capability, the capacity for violence that the Harkonnen operation maintained, made the body's condition irrelevant to the question of whether the Baron's desires would be satisfied. This is the darkest dimension of the Baron's relationship with his body. The body's failure did not limit the body's capacity for the imposition of the Baron's will on other bodies. The suspensor belt compensated for the weight. The Harkonnen governance compensated for the grotesqueness. The power compensated for everything that the disease had taken, in every dimension, except the one that no compensation could address. The Baron's own experience of inhabiting the body, of looking at the flesh that the disease had produced, of knowing that the body he lived in was the body that the disease, the Bene Gesserit weapon, the consequence of the assault he had committed, had made. The Baron's relationship with the Bene Gesserit was shaped by the knowledge, partial, incomplete, but present, that the sisterhood had done something to him. He knew. Not the details, not the mechanism, not the identity of the alteration, as a Bene Gesserit biological weapon, rather than as a natural metabolic disorder, but the Baron was too intelligent and too suspicious to accept the progressive failure of his body as simply an unfortunate medical condition. The timing was suggestive. The onset of the metabolic dysfunction correlated with the encounter with Merhiam, and the correlation was not lost on a mind that assessed correlations as a professional practice. The Baron suspected the Bene Gesserit. The suspicion was correct in its direction, and incomplete in its details. The Baron understood that the Sisterhood's capabilities included biological interventions that his physicians could not detect, and he suspected that the intervention had been made during the encounter with Merhiam, but he could not prove it. The proof would have required the identification of the alteration's mechanism, and the mechanism was invisible to the medical technology his physicians employed. The suspicion shaped the Baron's political relationship with the Bene Gesserit in ways that affected his approach to the Arrakis conspiracy and its aftermath. The Baron did not trust the Sisterhood, not because the Sisterhood's political reputation suggested they were untrustworthy, but because the Baron's personal experience suggested they were capable of the kind of covert biological warfare that most political actors did not include in their assessment of the Sisterhood's capabilities. The Baron's assessment of the Bene Gesserit was, in this respect, more accurate than most. He understood from personal experience that the Sisterhood's capabilities included dimensions that the public understanding of the Bene Gesserit did not encompass. The irony, and the Dune saga is constructed around ironies of this kind, was that the Baron's suspicion of the Bene Gesserit was correct about the disease, but incorrect about the Sisterhood's role in the larger picture. The Baron suspected that the Bene Gesserit had damaged him personally. He did not suspect that the Bene Gesserit had been managing his genetic line, that the assault on Merhiam had been the context for the production of a child. That the child was Jessica, that Jessica had been placed with the Atreides, that the entire Harkonnen-Atreides conflict was playing out within a framework that the Bene Gesserit had designed and that neither house fully understood. The Baron's intelligence, formidable as it was, operated within the information available to him. The information available to him did not include the breeding program's records or the Sisterhood's genetic management of the Harkonnen line. The Baron could see the immediate dimensions of the political landscape with extraordinary clarity. He could not see the genetic dimensions, because the genetic dimensions were managed by an institution that had been concealing them for 90 generations and that was not going to reveal them to the man whose genetics they were managing. The assault on Arrakis, the military operation that destroyed House Atreides and placed the Baron in control of the spice operation, was the Baron's body in action in the most consequential political context of his career. The Baron came to Arrakis. Not in person for the initial assault, the military operation was conducted by Raban's forces, supported by the disguised Sardaukar, and the Baron's personal presence was not required for the operation's execution. But the Baron came to Arrakis for the aftermath, for the management of the conquered territory, for the assessment of the victory's completeness, for the personal satisfaction of seeing the Atreides destroyed and the prize recovered. His presence on Arrakis, the body in the suspensor belt, hovering through the corridors of the Arrakeen residency that the Atreides had occupied and that the Harkonnens now controlled, was the physical expression of the victory that the mind had designed. The Baron moved through the spaces that the Atreides had inhabited, inspected the damage that the assault had produced, assessed the condition of the prize that the conspiracy had been designed to deliver. The encounter with Leto, the dying Duke, whose body had been broken by the assault, and whose final act would be the deployment of the poison gas concealed in his tooth, was the Baron's most dangerous personal moment during the Arrakis operation. Leto was dying. The Harkonnen assault had accomplished its military objectives, and the Duke was in the Baron's custody, his body damaged beyond recovery, his political position destroyed, his house in ruins. The Baron came to see him, came to look at the defeated enemy, to demonstrate the victory in the most personal form available, to make the Duke see the body in the suspensor belt and understand that this was the person who had engineered the destruction. Leto's final weapon was the tooth. The Suk Doctor Yue, the traitor whose conditioning had been broken, whose betrayal had opened the Atreides' defences to the Harkonnen assault, had provided Leto with a last resort, a poison capsule concealed in a tooth, deployable through the bite that would release the gas in proximity to the Baron. The weapon was designed to kill the Baron, to use the Duke's dying body as a delivery system for the poison that would remove the mind behind the conspiracy. The Baron survived, not through any action of his own. The poison gas was deployed, the room was filled, and the Baron's survival was a matter of the gas's dispersal pattern and the suspensor belt's positioning rather than any defensive capability the Baron possessed. The Baron's body was exposed to the gas. The body survived, though the exposure killed Peter de Vries, who was closer to the source and who received a lethal concentration of the compound. The near-death experience on Arrakis, the moment at which the body in the suspensor belt came closest to termination through the action of the enemy the mind had been trying to destroy, was a moment of vulnerability that the Baron's subsequent management of the Arrakis operation was designed to compensate for. The Baron had been threatened. The Baron had been physically endangered. The body that could not stand under its own power had been exposed to a weapon that could have ended the life it contained. The Baron's response was the response of a consciousness that had been reminded of the body's fragility and that was recalibrating its approach to risk in light of the reminder. The Yue betrayal deserves examination in the body context, because Yue's role in the Atreides' destruction was itself a story of a body compromised, not by disease, but by the breaking of a conditioning that was supposed to be unbreakable. Wellington Yue was a Suk Doctor. The Suk medical tradition maintained that its practitioners' conditioning, the deep psychological programming that the Suk training installed, was inviolable, that a Suk doctor could not be compelled to betray the patient whose care the conditioning committed the doctor to. The conditioning was the Suk tradition's guarantee. The diamond tattoo on the forehead was the visible marker of a person whose loyalty was neurological rather than voluntary, whose commitment to the patient was embedded in the nervous system's architecture rather than being a matter of choice. The Baron broke the conditioning. Not through force applied to Yue's body, the conditioning was too deeply installed for physical coercion to overcome. Through the application of force to someone else's body, Yue's wife, Wanna, who was captured by the Harkonnens and whose suffering was used as the lever that the conditioning's designers had not accounted for. The conditioning said, "Do not betray your patient." The Harkonnen said, "Your wife is in our custody, and the suffering we are inflicting on her body will continue until you do what we require." The conditioning broke, not cleanly. Yue's betrayal of the Atreides was accompanied by the installation of the tooth weapon that was designed to take the Baron with the Duke, the act of revenge that the broken conditioning permitted, even as the conditioning's rupture produced the betrayal the Harkonnens had demanded. Yue betrayed the Atreides and tried to kill the Baron simultaneously. The contradictory acts reflecting the contradictory forces operating on a conditioned mind that was no longer operating under the conditions the conditioning had been designed for. The Baron killed Yue after the betrayal was complete. The killing was characteristic. The Baron had promised Yue a reunion with his wife, and the promise was fulfilled in the Harkonnen fashion. Yue was reunited with Wanna through the shared condition of death. The promise was technically kept and morally violated, which was the Harkonnen-style's signature move, the formal compliance with the letter of an agreement accompanied by the deliberate violation of its spirit. The Yue episode demonstrated the Baron's understanding of bodies and what could be done with them. The Baron could not break the Suk conditioning through direct assault on Yue's body. The conditioning was too robust for that. The Baron could break it through the assault on another body, Wanna's, whose suffering activated emotional circuits in Yue's consciousness that the conditioning's designers had not fully insulated against. The body was the lever, in this case someone else's body, and the Baron understood how to use the lever with the precision that his intelligence brought to every tool in his arsenal. The 2 years between the Atreides' destruction and the battle for Arrakis were the years in which the Baron's management of Arrakis was tested against the reality that the conquest had produced, and the testing revealed the limitations of the governance philosophy that the Baron's body had shaped. Rabban was installed as the planetary governor. The Baron's plan was dual phase. Rabban would govern first, with the harshness that the Baron's calculation determined would produce the conditions for the plan's second phase. The harshness was designed to make the population desperate, to crush any remaining Atreides loyalty, to extract the maximum spice revenue, to create in the governed population a level of suffering that would make the second phase's governor, Fade Routher, the gentle replacement, look like a liberator by comparison. The plan was clever in the way that the Baron's plans were always clever. Strategic, multi-phase, calibrated to produce political outcomes through the managed application of governance pressure. The plan was also characteristic of the body philosophy. The governed population was an instrument, a body to be stressed and then relieved, a system whose responses the Baron's strategic intelligence could predict and manage. The plan did not account for the Fremen. The 2 years during which Rabban was crushing the population and extracting the spice were the same 2 years during which Paul was in the desert, building the alliance with a Fremen that would produce the military capability the Baron's planning had not anticipated. The Baron's plan for Arrakis assumed a population that could be managed through the application of pressure. That could be stressed and then relieved. That would respond to the governance's manipulation in the predictable ways that the Baron's experience of governing populations had documented. The Fremen were not this population. The Fremen could not be managed through the application of pressure because the desert had already applied more pressure than the Baron's governance could produce. The environmental demands of Arrakis, the water discipline, the worm danger, the conditions of survival that the desert imposed had produced a population that was pre-stressed, that had already been through the hardening that the Baron's plan was designed to produce as a political tool. Raban's harshness was not the worst thing the Fremen had experienced. The desert was worse, and the desert had not broken the Fremen, it had made them. The failure of the plan was a body philosophy failure, the failure of a governance approach that treated populations as bodies to be manipulated through the application and release of pressure. The approach worked with populations whose experience of pressure was limited to the governance's application of it. The approach failed with a population whose experience of pressure included the environmental demands of one of the most hostile worlds in the known universe. The Baron, observing the plan's failure from the remove of his communication with Raban and his intelligence network's fragmentary reporting, adjusted. The adjustment was characteristic. The Baron's intelligence was not rigid, was capable of incorporating new information and modifying the approach that the new information required. But the adjustment was limited by the same governance philosophy that had produced the failure. The Baron could modify the application of pressure, could change the instruments through which the pressure was applied, could recalibrate the timing and the intensity. The Baron could not change the fundamental approach, could not abandon the body as instrument philosophy that the adjustment was operating within. The recalibration was overtaken by events. Paul's development in the desert, the building of the Fremen alliance, the growth of the military capability that the Fremen's desert training and Paul's prescient leadership would eventually produce. These developments outpaced the Baron's capacity to adjust the plan that had not accounted for them. The battle for Arrakis was the consequence, the military confrontation that the Baron's planning had not predicted and that the Harkonnen forces were not prepared for. The Baron's death was the most intimate execution in the saga's history, and the intimacy was what made it devastating rather than simply fatal. He died in the battle for Arrakis. Not in the battle's military dimension, not in the combat between the Fremen and the Sardaukar and the Harkonnens that constituted the battle's conventional phase. In the political confrontation that followed the military phase, the scene in which the assembled power of the Imperium was gathered in one space and the various actors were positioning themselves for the political settlement that would determine the post-battle order. The Baron was there because the battle had gone catastrophically wrong for the Harkonnens. The Fremen, the desert people whom the Baron had dismissed as a nuisance population, whose military capability the Harkonnen intelligence apparatus had failed to accurately assess, whose alliance with the Atreides ere the Harkonnen planning had not anticipated, had overwhelmed the combined Harkonnen-Sardaukar forces with a speed and a ferocity that the military planning had not prepared for. The sandworm cavalry charged through the breached shield wall, the nuclear demolition of the mountain pass, the Fremen warriors' devastating effectiveness against troops who had never faced Fremen combat capability at full scale. The battle was a catastrophe for the forces the Baron had deployed. The political aftermath placed the Baron in the presence of his enemies, Paul Atreides, who was commanding the Fremen and who was demonstrating the prescient capability that confirmed his status as the Kwisatz Haderach, and Paul's family, including the children and the associates who constituted the Atreides court that was forming in the wake of the victory. Elia was there. Jessica and Paul's daughter, the preborn child whose capabilities exceeded what her age should have permitted, whose other memory gave her access to knowledge and awareness that no 4-year-old should have possessed. Elia was there, in the room where the political settlement was being negotiated, present as a member of the Atreides household whose status the victory had elevated from refugees to rulers. The Baron looked at Elia. The texts record this moment. The fat man in the suspensor belt looking at the small child, the child looking back with eyes that contained more than a child's eyes should contain. The look was brief. What happened next was briefer. Elia killed the Baron with a Gom Jabbar. The Gom Jabbar was a poisoned needle, the same class of weapon that the Bene Gesserit used in the test of humanness that Mohiam had administered to Paul. The weapon was small, concealable, lethal through the delivery of a meta-cyanide poison that produced death with a speed that prevented any medical response. The weapon was a Bene Gesserit tool, and Elia's use of it reflected the Bene Gesserit heritage that her preborn condition had given her access to, the knowledge of the weapon, the knowledge of how to use it, the knowledge of where to place the needle to ensure the poison's delivery. She placed it in the Baron's flesh. The suspensor belt prevented the Baron's body from hitting the floor. The body hovered, supported by the belt's gravitational nullification as the poison did its work. The Baron died in the air, died floating, as he had lived, floating, the body remaining in its suspended position as the life left it, and the political calculation that had made the Baron one of the most dangerous minds in the Imperium ceased to operate. The death was appropriate in ways that the Baron's strategic mind would have appreciated if the mind had been alive to appreciate them. The granddaughter he did not know was his granddaughter killed him with a weapon from the institution that had given him the disease that had made the body what it was. The child of the Atreides line, the line the Baron had tried to destroy, was the person who ended the Baron's life, using the tools of the Bene Gesserit, the institution that had started the body's destruction years before the child completed it. The body's death was not the Baron's ending. This is the fact that transforms the Baron's story from the story of a powerful man who died in a political confrontation into something more complex and more disturbing and more consequential for the saga's larger narrative. The Baron survived in other memory. This sentence requires careful explanation, because what it describes is not survival in the ordinary sense, not the continuation of the Baron's consciousness in the form that the consciousness had taken while the body was alive. What survived was the Baron's presence, the personality, the accumulated experience, the quality of mind that had made the Baron who he was, preserved in the genetic memory that every human being carried, and that the specific conditions of the preborn and Reverend Mother experience made accessible to conscious navigation. Elia carried the Baron's genetics. She was his granddaughter, Jessica's daughter, and Jessica was the Baron's daughter through the Bene Gesserit breeding program. The genetics that connected the Baron to Elia were the same genetics that carried the ancestral presences in other memory, and when Elia's pre-born condition opened other memory to her consciousness from before the beginning of her individual development, the Baron's presence was among the presences she found there. Not a ghost, not a spirit in the mystical sense that the term implied. A presence, a personality preserved in the genetic memory with the full weight of its experiential reality, carrying the Baron's intelligence and the Baron's strategic capability and the Baron's appetite for power and the Baron's accumulated understanding of how power was obtained and maintained and deployed. The presence was not the living Baron. It did not have the Baron's body, did not operate in the physical world, did not have the autonomy that the living Baron had exercised, but it was the Baron's personality, recognizable as the Baron, carrying the qualities that had made the living Baron what he was. The presence was in Elia from the beginning of her conscious existence, not from the moment of the Baron's death. The death occurred while Elia was already carrying the preborn condition, already holding the ancestral presences that the in utero exposure to the water of life had opened. The Baron's presence was there before the Baron died. Because the presence was genetic rather than chronological, it was carried in the Dina, preserved in the ancestral memory. Accessible through the biological mechanisms that the Bene Gesserit's tradition documented, and that the pre-born condition activated without the controlled preparation that the Reverend Mother ordeal normally provided. Elia managed the presence for years. This is the part of the story that the dramatic conclusion sometimes obscures. The years during which Elia coexisted with the Baron's presence in her consciousness without being overwhelmed by it. The years during which her individual self maintained its integrity against the pressure that the ancestral presences, including the Baron's, exerted, Elia governed. She served as regent during Paul's absence, managed the political apparatus of the Atreides Empire, navigated the institutional landscape of the post-Jihad Imperium with a capability that reflected both her own intelligence and the resources that other memory provided. The management was difficult. The Bene Gesserit's institutional knowledge said that the preborn condition made abomination a persistent risk, that the individual self, formed without the developmental protection that normal birth provided, was perpetually vulnerable to the displacement by an ancestral presence that was stronger or more persistent or simply better positioned to exploit a moment of weakness. Elia's management of the Baron's presence was one front in the continuous war that the pre-born condition imposed. The war between the individual identity and the ancestral voices. The war that Elia had been fighting since before she was born, and that the Baron's presence was only one combatant in. The Baron waited. This is the quality of the presence that made it different from most of the ancestral voices that Elia managed, not the waiting itself, which any ancestral presence could do, but the strategic patience of the waiting. The Baron's presence was not simply a personality pressing against the boundaries of Alia's self. It was a strategic intelligence that was assessing the boundaries, identifying the weak points, developing the approach that would eventually allow it to cross them. The living Baron had been a master of strategic patience. The conspiracy against the Atreides had taken years to develop and execute. The management of the Arrakis spice operation had required the kind of sustained attention to political dynamics that only a patient intelligence could maintain. The Baron's approach to every significant objective had been characterized by the willingness to wait, to observe, to assess, to position, and to strike at the moment when the positioning had created the conditions for the strike's success. The dead Baron brought this same strategic patience to the campaign against Elia's self. The presence assessed the self, identified the moments when the self was weakened, when the pressures of governance accumulated past the point where the self could simultaneously manage the political demands and maintain the internal boundaries, when the emotional stresses of Elia's personal life created vulnerabilities that the maintained self could not fully address. The presence waited for these moments and, when they came, extended its influence incrementally, accumulating small gains rather than attempting the dramatic displacement that the self's defenses might have detected and resisted. The possession was progressive rather than sudden, and the progressiveness was part of what made it so damaging, both to Elia and to the political apparatus that Elia was managing. The early signs were behavioral. Alia's decision-making shifted, not dramatically, not in ways that the people around her could point to as evidence of a crisis, but in the quality of the decisions. The decisions became more Harkonnen, not in the crude sense of becoming more cruel, though the cruelty increased, in the strategic sense of becoming more interested in the accumulation and maintenance of power as an end in itself, rather than in the Atreides tradition's commitment to governance as a form of service. The shift was subtle. The Atreides political tradition, the tradition that Paul had represented and that Alia's regency was supposed to maintain, was organized around the principle that governance was a responsibility rather than a privilege. The governor served the governed. The power was justified by the service it enabled rather than by the satisfaction it provided to the person who held it. This was the tradition that Alia had been raised in, that her Atreides heritage and her Fremen enculturation had instilled, that the institutional framework of the Regency was designed to maintain. The Baron's influence shifted the orientation. Not openly, the shift was not a public repudiation of the Atreides tradition. It was a drift, a gradual reorientation of the decision-making's underlying priorities, a slow replacement of the Atreides principle of governance as service with the Harkonnen principle of governance as power. The decisions looked similar from the outside. The motivation had changed from the inside. The Bene Gesserit observed the shift. The Sisterhood's intelligence networks, the observation and analysis capabilities that the Bene Gesserit maintained throughout the Imperium's political landscape, detected the behavioral changes that the Baron's influence was producing in Alia's governance. The Sisterhood's analysis concluded what the institutional knowledge of abomination had predicted. The preborn consciousness was losing the war against the ancestral presence, and the presence that was winning was the Baron's. The conclusion produced institutional alarm. Alia was the regent, the person governing the Imperium in the name of the Atreides, the person whose decisions affected the political landscape that the Bene Gesserit was trying to navigate. If Alia was being influenced, or worse, controlled by the Baron's presence, the political implications were significant. The regency that the Atreides tradition was supposed to be maintaining was being redirected by a Harkonnen intelligence, and the redirection was invisible to anyone who lacked the Bene Gesserit's analytical capability or the institutional knowledge of abomination that the analysis was grounded in. Jessica was sent to assess the situation. The Bene Gesserit dispatched Jessica, the woman whose rebellion had produced both Paul and Alia, whose relationship with the Sisterhood was complicated by the rebellion, but whose analytical capability and personal knowledge of the people involved made her the most qualified assessor available to Arrakis to evaluate what was happening to Alia and to determine whether the abomination risk the Sisterhood feared was materializing. Jessica's assessment confirmed the worst. Her observation of Alia, conducted with the Bene Gesserit's trained perception, informed by the personal knowledge that a mother's relationship with her daughter provided, confirmed that the behavioral shifts the Sisterhood had detected were the product of ancestral displacement. The Baron was not simply influencing Alia's decisions. The Baron was directing them with an increasing degree of control that reflected the progressive displacement of Alia's individual self by the Baron's personality. The assessment was devastating. Jessica was observing the abomination of her own daughter, the thing the Bene Gesserit had warned about, the thing that the preborn condition made possible, the thing that the Sisterhood's institutional knowledge said was irreversible once it had progressed past a certain point. Jessica was seeing her daughter consumed by the personality of her own father, the man who had assaulted the woman who had given Jessica to the Bene Gesserit, the man whose genetics Jessica carried and whose presence was now dominant in the consciousness of the grandchild he had never known he had. The genetic irony was as complete as any the saga produced. The The Baron's assault on Mohiam had produced Jessica. Jessica's rebellion had produced Paul, and, through the Water of Life ordeal, the conditions for Alia's preborn status. Alia's preborn status had given the Baron's ancestral presence access to a consciousness that could not adequately defend against it. The Baron's violence against one Bene Gesserit, Mohiam, had produced, through the chain of genetic consequence, the conditions for the Baron's posthumous violence against his own granddaughter. The Baron's experience of the possession, what it was like for the Baron's presence to be the presence that was gaining dominance in Alia's consciousness, is the dimension that the texts address indirectly, but that the saga's logic permits us to examine. The ancestral presences in other memory were not passive recordings. They were subjectivities, personalities carrying the experiential weight of the lives they had lived, capable of the kind of intentional action that personalities performed. The Baron's presence in Alia's other memory was not simply a set of memories that Alia could access. It was a personality, the Baron's personality, with the Baron's intelligence and the Baron's strategic capability and the Baron's appetite for control. What the personality wanted was what the living Baron had wanted: power, the accumulation and exercise of control over the environment the personality found itself in. The living Baron had exercised this appetite through the political and military and economic tools that House Harkonnen had provided. The dead Baron's presence exercised it through the only tool available, the consciousness it was inhabiting. The possession was, from the Baron's perspective, a form of governance, the management of a territory, Alia's consciousness, through the same strategic approach that the living Baron had applied to every other territory he had managed: assess the landscape, identify the vulnerabilities, position for advantage, exploit the positioning when the conditions are right. The living Baron had done this with planets and houses and political alliances. The dead Baron's presence was doing it with a person's self. The approach was characteristic. The Baron's presence did not attempt to overwhelm Alia's self through brute force. The ancestral presences in other memory were capable of exerting pressure, but the pressure could be resisted by a self that was prepared for it, and Alia's self, despite its pre-born vulnerabilities, was not without defences. Instead, the presence operated the way the living Baron had operated, through patience, through the exploitation of moments of weakness, through the gradual accumulation of influence that the target's defences could not detect in any individual instance, but that the aggregate could not resist. The counsel was the mechanism. The Baron's presence offered counsel to Alia's conscious mind, suggestions, perspectives, interpretations of the political situations that Alia's governance required her to navigate. The counsel was not obviously Harkonnen. It was not crude, not obviously self-serving, not the kind of advice that Alia's conscious self would have recognized as coming from an adversary. It was sophisticated, the product of the Baron's lifetime of political experience, offered in a form that Alia's conscious mind could accept as useful input, rather than identifying as an adversary's attempt at manipulation. The sophistication was the danger. If the Baron's counsel had been obviously Harkonnen, obviously oriented toward the accumulation of power at the expense of the governed, obviously reflective of the Harkonnen governance philosophy that the Atreides tradition explicitly rejected, Alia's conscious mind would have recognized it and resisted it. But the counsel was not obvious. It was the counsel of a strategic mind that understood the political landscape, that could offer assessments that were accurate and recommendations that were effective, that presented itself as a resource rather than as a threat. The counsel was, in many individual instances, good advice. The Baron's strategic intelligence was real, and the assessments the presence offered were often accurate. The Harkonnen tradition's understanding of how power operated was not wrong, and the recommendations the presence provided were often effective in the immediate sense of producing the outcomes that the political situations required. the advice worked. The working was what made it dangerous, because the advice's effectiveness built the trust that the trust building was designed to produce. The progressive acceptance of the council, the progressive reliance on the perspective the council provided, the progressive integration of the Baron's analytical framework into the decision-making process that Elia's governance required. By the time the integration was complete, by the time the Baron's perspective had become so thoroughly incorporated into Elia's decision-making that the distinction between Elia's own assessment and the Baron's counsel was no longer clear, the possession was effectively accomplished. The individual self that was Elia was not eliminated. It was marginalized, pushed to the periphery of the consciousness that it had once been the center of, its protests and its resistance overridden by a personality that had accumulated enough influence to operate as the primary agent in the consciousness's decision-making. Elia became, in effect, the Baron. Not completely, the individual self persisted, protested, experienced the displacement with the horror that the displacement's victims consistently reported in the Bene Gesserit's institutional records. But the personality that was making the decisions, directing the governance, choosing the responses to the political situations the Regency confronted, this personality was the Baron's. The governor of the Imperium was, in the dimension that mattered most, a dead Harkonnen operating through the body and the political position of a living Atreides. The consequences of the possession played out across the years of the Regency in ways that affected the political landscape of the Imperium and that set the conditions for the crisis that the twins, Leto and Ganima, would eventually have to navigate. The Regency deteriorated. The governance that Elia provided, increasingly directed by the Baron's presence, increasingly oriented toward the accumulation and maintenance of power rather than the provision of service, produced a political environment that the Atreides tradition's supporters found increasingly uncomfortable. The religious institution that had been built around the Muad'Dib mythology, the Kizarate, the priesthood that managed the Imperium's spiritual life in the name of the dead emperor, calcified under the Regency's management, becoming more interested in its own institutional preservation than in the spiritual functions it was supposed to serve. The political alliances that the Atreides tradition had built, the relationships with the Fremen, the accommodations with the Landsraad's more principled houses, the working relationships that Paul's governance had established, frayed under the Regency's shifted priorities. The Fremen, whose loyalty to the Atreides was grounded in the personal relationship with Paul and in the shared experience of the Desert War, found the Regency's governance increasingly alien to the traditions and the values that the loyalty was based on. The ecological crisis on Arrakis, the terraforming program's success-producing conditions that threatened the sandworm ecology and the spice production, was managed with the same shifted priorities. The crisis required the kind of long-term, patient, ecologically informed governance that the Atreides tradition's best practitioners had provided. The Regency, under the Baron's influence, managed it with the Harkonnen tradition's characteristic short-termism, addressing the immediate symptoms without investing in the long-term solutions the ecological situation required. The twins observed all of this. Leto and Ganima, pre-born like their aunt, carrying the same ancestral presences in their other memory, including the Baron's, watched the Regency's deterioration with the prescient awareness of children who could see where the deterioration was leading. They saw the Baron's influence in Elia's governance. They saw the consequences of the influence in the political landscape's degeneration. They saw the ecological crisis deepening. They saw the paths through the probability space narrowing as the Regency's mismanagement accumulated. The twins' response to the Baron's presence in their own other memory, their management of the ancestral voice that was consuming their aunt, was different from Elia's response. The twins had each other. The co-development that the shared womb had provided gave each twin something Elia had lacked: a peer, a reference point, a consciousness developing in real time alongside the other, rather than being one more ancestral presence pressing in from the past. The twins' resilience against the Baron's influence, their capacity to recognize the council for what it was and to resist the integration that Elia had succumbed to, was, by cautious interpretive reading, a product of this co-development. The Baron's presence was in them. It spoke, it offered, it counselled, but the twins could compare the counsel against each other's independent assessment, could use the sibling relationship as a calibration device that Elia had never had, could maintain the individual self's integrity against the ancestral pressure with a resilience that the solitary pre-born consciousness could not match. Elia's end was the Baron's end too. When Elia fell from the temple tower, choosing death over the continued existence of a consciousness she no longer controlled, the Baron's presence in that consciousness went with her. Not destroyed, the presence was genetic, was carried in the DNA of everyone who shared the Baron's bloodline, would continue to exist as an ancestral presence in other memory for as long as the bloodline continued. But the active possession, the dominant position that the presence had achieved in Elia's consciousness, ended with the consciousness it was dominating. The fall was Elia's final act of self-determination. The individual self that the Baron's presence had marginalized, the Elia who had been the center of the consciousness before the displacement, reasserted itself in the act of choosing death. The choice was an Atreides choice, the refusal to continue under conditions that made the continuation a form of servitude, the insistence on determining one's own ending rather than allowing the ending to be determined by the forces that had compromised the life. The Baron, in the moment of Elia's fall, lost the territory he had been governing. The consciousness that his presence had managed to dominate, the political position, the access to the Regency's power, the ability to direct the governance of the Imperium through the body and the authority of the Atreides regent, all of it ended when Elia's body hit the ground. The ending was appropriate. The Baron, who had lived by power, who had accumulated and maintained and deployed power across decades of ruthless governance, whose entire existence had been organized around the exercise of authority over others, was ended by the person he was trying to govern refusing to be governed anymore. The final act of resistance, the jump, the fall, the death, was the one thing the Baron's presence could not prevent and could not recover from. The territory refused to be territory. This was the reversal of the Baron's entire philosophy of governance. The Harkonnen tradition said, the governed exist to serve the governor, the resources exist to be used, the bodies exist to be deployed. Elia's final act said, the governed can refuse. The body can choose to end itself rather than continue to serve. The resource can destroy itself rather than be used. The territory can refuse to be territory, and the refusal is absolute. The Baron's presence in Elia's other memory could not have anticipated this, could not have included in its strategic assessment of the consciousness it was trying to dominate, the possibility that the consciousness would choose self-destruction over continued domination. The living Baron's strategic thinking had not included the suicide of the governed as a significant variable in the governance calculation, because the living Baron's governance had operated in conditions where the governed did not have the option of self-destruction as a meaningful form of resistance. Elia did, and the exercise of that option ended the Baron's posthumous career as definitively as the Gom Jabbar had ended his living one. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was Frank Herbert's most sustained examination of the relationship between the body and the self, not through the language of philosophy, but through the specific, detailed, narratively grounded treatment of what it meant to be a consciousness inhabiting a body that had been fundamentally altered from its original condition. The examination operated at multiple levels simultaneously, which is characteristic of Herbert's approach to the Dune saga's thematic content. At the surface level, the Baron's body was a marker of the character's villainy, the visual grotesqueness that signaled to the reader that this person was not to be trusted, that the body's external condition reflected an internal corruption that the narrative would document. At this level, the body was a literary device, functioning the way that physical deformity or unusual appearance had functioned in storytelling traditions across the history of narrative as a visual shorthand for the character's moral condition. But Herbert was too sophisticated a writer to leave the body at the surface level, and the text's treatment of the Baron's condition exceeded the literary device function in ways that rewarded sustained attention. The sophistication was in the causation. The Baron's body was not the product of moral failure, not the consequence of gluttony or sloth, or any of the personal failings that the traditional literary use of grotesque bodies attributed to their bearers. The Baron's body was the product of an assault and its response, the Baron's assault on Mohiam and Mohiam's biological retaliation. The body's condition was a consequence of violence, not of character, and the distinction mattered because it changed the moral architecture of the grotesqueness. A body that was grotesque because of the character's moral failings was a body that the reader could contemplate without moral complication. The grotesqueness was deserved, was the physical expression of the moral reality, was justice made visible. A body that was grotesque because of an act of violence, even when the violence was itself a response to a prior act of violence, was a body whose grotesqueness raised questions that the simple moral reading could not answer. Was the Baron's body justified? Was Mohiam's retaliation proportionate? Was the progressive, lifelong, irreversible alteration of a person's metabolic function an appropriate response to an assault, regardless of how violent the assault was? Herbert did not answer these questions. He posed them, embedded them in the narrative's treatment of the Baron's body, made them available to the reader who was paying attention, left the moral assessment to the reader's own judgment. The Baron was a villain. The Baron's body was a punishment, but the punishment was inflicted by an institution, the Bene Gesserit, whose moral authority the saga consistently questioned. For an act that was itself a crime, the assault on Mohiam committed in a context, the breeding program's management of the Harkonnen genetic line that the Baron had not consented to, and that the Bene Gesserit's institutional purposes had arranged. The moral complexity of the body's causation was part of what made the Baron a more interesting character than the simple villain reading suggested. The Baron was not simply bad. He was damaged, altered, changed, made into something he had not been by forces that he had partially provoked and partially been subjected to. The damage did not excuse the cruelty. The cruelty existed independently of the damage and would have existed without it. The Baron's strategic ruthlessness was a quality of his mind, not a consequence of his body's condition. But the damage added a dimension to the character that the undamaged villain would not have had, the dimension of response. The Baron was responding to what had been done to him, and the response was part of what shaped the form his villainy took. The comparison between the Baron's body and Leto II's body is the comparison that Herbert's architecture invites. Because the two bodies represent the saga's two most sustained examinations of what happens when a human consciousness inhabits a body that is fundamentally different from the one it was designed for. Leto II chose his transformation. He walked into the desert at 9 years old, allowed the sandtrout to cover him, accepted the progressive alteration of his body from human toward sandworm. The choice was informed, Leto understood through the prescient vision what the transformation would produce across the 3,500 years of its execution. The choice was voluntary. No one forced Leto to accept the sandtrout. No one administered the transformation against his will. The choice was made in service of something the chooser valued: the golden path, the species' survival, the long-term preservation of conditions under which human freedom was possible. The Baron did not choose his transformation. The metabolic alteration was administered without his knowledge or consent, as the consequence of an act whose consequences the Baron had not anticipated. The transformation was not informed. The Baron did not understand what was happening to his body, did not know the cause of the progressive weight gain, did not have access to the information that would have allowed him to make an informed decision about whether to accept or resist the change. The transformation was not in service of anything the Baron valued. It was a punishment, or a response, or a weapon, depending on the framing. But it was not something the Baron had accepted in pursuit of an objective. The two transformations produced similar physical conditions. Both Leto and the Baron inhabited bodies that could not function in ordinary human ways, that required technological support for basic physical operations, that could not interact with other human beings in the embodied ways that ordinary human interaction assumed. Both lived inside bodies that communicated grotesqueness to the people who encountered them. That produced in observers the visceral discomfort that the human visual system generated in response to bodies that violated the expectations of human morphology. The responses to the transformations were profoundly different, and the difference is the thing that the comparison illuminates about both characters and about the saga's larger argument. Leto responded with sacrifice. The transformation was the medium of his sacrifice, the thing he gave up in service of the golden path, the price he paid for the species' survival, the body that could not touch another human being, that could not experience the embodied pleasures that human consciousness was designed to enjoy, that was progressively becoming something that the word human could not contain. This body was the cost, and the cost was acknowledged as a cost, and the endurance of the cost was the measure of the commitment's depth. The Baron responded with aggression. The transformation was the medium of his anger, the thing that fueled his cruelty, that sharpened his appetite for the demonstrations of power that compensated for the body's failure. The body that could not stand, that floated in a suspensor belt, that communicated grotesqueness to everyone who saw it, this body was the provocation. And the response to the provocation was the intensification of the control that the body's condition made the Baron feel he needed to maintain. The difference was not simply a difference of character, though it was that. It was a difference of meaning, a difference in what the transformed body meant for the consciousness that inhabited it. Leto's body meant sacrifice, the Baron's body meant injury, and the meaning shaped the response, which shaped the life, which shaped the impact on the world the body existed in. Leto's sacrifice produced the Golden Path, the 3,000-year project that preserved the species' capacity for freedom. The Baron's injury produced the Harkonnen governance, the decades of ruthless, exploitative management that treated the governed as instruments and the environment as a resource and the exercise of power as the purpose of having it. The same physical condition, a body that was no longer human in the way that the consciousness inside it remembered, produced opposite political outcomes, depending on whether the consciousness inside the body understood the condition as sacrifice or as injury. This is the argument about embodiment that the comparison makes. The body's condition does not determine the response. The meaning the consciousness assigns to the condition determines the response. The same grotesque body can produce a savior or a tyrant, depending on what the grotesqueness means to the person who is living inside it. The Baron's legacy in the Imperium's history was defined by the contradiction between his personal destruction and his genetic perpetuation. Personally, the Baron was destroyed. His body was killed at Arrakis by the Gom Jabbar. His political apparatus, the intelligence network, the military capability, the economic infrastructure that constituted House Harkonnen's institutional position was dismantled by Paul's victory and the Fremen's subsequent administration of the former Harkonnen territories. His nephews were dead, Fade killed by Paul in single combat, Rabban killed by the Fremen in the battle. His house was finished as a political entity, its name associated with the tyranny and the exploitation that the Atreides' victory had ended. Its reputation serving as the negative example against which the New Order's legitimacy was measured. Genetically, the Baron was perpetuated. His genetic material, carried through Jessica to Paul, through Paul to the twins, became the most consequential genetic heritage in human history. The God Emperor carried the Baron's genetics. The descendants of the God Emperor's breeding program carried the Baron's genetics. Every person in the Imperium whose bloodline included the Atreides line, which, after the God Emperor's 500-year management of human genetics, was a substantial fraction of the total population, carried something of the Baron's genetic inheritance. The genetic perpetuation was not the continuation of the Baron's personality. The genetics did not carry the cruelty, the appetite for power, the strategic ruthlessness that had characterized the living Baron's use of his intelligence. The genetics carried the intelligence itself, the cognitive capability that the Baron had deployed in service of the Harkonnen political operation. The strategic thinking that had made the Baron dangerous, the quality of mind that the Bene Gesserit's breeding program had valued enough to incorporate into the genetic lines they were managing. The Bene Gesserit had wanted the Baron's genetics for the breeding program precisely because the genetics carried quality, not moral quality. The Sisterhood's assessment of the Baron's moral character was as negative as anyone's. Cognitive quality. The intelligence, the strategic capability, the capacity for sustained analytical thinking that the Baron demonstrated across decades of political operation. The breeding program was interested in genetics, not in character, and the Baron's genetics carried traits that the program's objectives required regardless of the character that the living expression of those genetics had produced. This is one of the most uncomfortable implications of the Bene Gesserit's breeding program, and the Baron's genetic legacy is the case that makes the implication most vivid. The program's genetic management was morally neutral. The Sisterhood selected for capability without regard to the moral dimension of the capability's expression. The Baron was cruel, exploitative, violent, and rapacious, and his genetics were valued by the program because the genetics produced intelligence and strategic capability that the program's objectives required. The morality of the person whose genetics the program managed was not a factor in the management's calculations. Paul Atreides, the hero of the saga's opening, the Kwisatz Haderach, the person whose capabilities the breeding program had been working toward for 92 generations, carried the Baron's genetics. The traits that made Paul formidable, the intelligence, the strategic capability, the capacity for the kind of analysis that the prescient vision's navigation required, were traits that the Harkonnen genetic contribution to Paul's heritage had helped to produce. The hero and the villain shared genetics, and the sharing was not coincidental. It was the product of the breeding program's deliberate management. which had combined the Harkonnen and Atreides lines because the combination produced the cognitive configuration the program was seeking. The moral neutrality of genetics, the fact that the same DNA could produce both the Baron's cruelty and Paul's vision, both the Harkonnen exploitation and the Atreides governance, depending on the conditions under which the genetics were expressed, is one of the saga's most important arguments about the relationship between nature and the moral character of the person the nature produces. The Baron's genetics were not bad genetics. They were not good genetics. They were genetics, a set of biological potentials that the conditions of development and the choices of the person they produced would shape into something good or something terrible, or, as in most real cases, something more complex than either simple category could contain. The Baron's body, and what it reveals about the Imperium. The Imperium's response to the Baron, the political landscape's accommodation of a man whose body violated every principle of physical fitness that the Landsraad's culture espoused, revealed something important about the Imperium's relationship with its own values. The Landsraad said it valued genetic fitness. The culture said it valued physical excellence. The political tradition said it assessed leaders by the visible evidence of their body's capability. And yet the Baron, whose body was the antithesis of everything the culture claimed to value, was one of the most powerful people in the known universe, was feared and respected and deferred to by the same political actors who claimed that physical fitness was a criterion for leadership quality. The accommodation was possible because the Landsraad's stated values were not its actual values. The culture said it valued physical fitness, but what it actually valued was power, and the Baron had power. The power was economic, military, political, and personal. The power existed independently of the body's condition, and the power was what the political landscape responded to. The body's condition was a test of the other actor's willingness to maintain the pretense. When a Landsraad noble visited the Baron and encountered the body in the suspensor belt, the 200 kilograms of grotesque flesh, floating in the gravitational nullification, moving in ways that the ordinary experience of human bodies did not prepare for, the noble had to choose respond to the body or respond to the power. The culture said respond to the body. The political calculation said respond to the power. The political calculation won. Every time. Because the political calculation addressed the things that actually mattered in the noble's strategic situation, and the body addressed only the things that the culture's pretenses said should matter. The Baron understood this dynamic and exploited it. The body's grotesqueness was, in the Baron's management, a filter, a test of whether the person encountering the body was going to be distracted by the cultural pretenses or was going to see through them to the power that the pretenses concealed. A person who was distracted by the body, who could not look past the grotesqueness to assess the capability behind it, was a person whose political judgment the Baron could not take seriously, because the judgment was organized around the wrong priorities. A person who could look past the body, who assessed the Baron's capability independently of the body's condition, was a person whose judgment was worth engaging with. The filter worked in both directions. The Baron's assessment of the people he encountered was informed by their response to the body, by whether they flinched, by whether they stared, by whether they were able to maintain the composure that the political context required in the presence of a body that the body's condition made difficult to maintain composure around. The response to the body was information about the other person's character, their capability for the kind of assessment that the political landscape required, their willingness to engage with reality rather than with the cultural pretenses that the reality contradicted. The Baron's servants and the people who operated the Harkonnen apparatus deserve attention because they were the population most directly affected by the body's condition and by the governance style that the body's condition shaped. The household staff who managed the Baron's daily existence, the people who maintained the suspense belt, who prepared the food the body consumed, who managed the physical accommodations that the body's condition required, who were present in the intimate dimensions of the Baron's life that the political presentations did not encompass. These people operated in a proximity to the body that produced a relationship with it that the political visitors' brief encounters did not. The staff saw the body in its unmanaged condition, not the political presentation that the suspensor belt and the staged audiences produced, but the physical reality of 200 kilograms of flesh in the conditions where the flesh was not being presented for political effect. The staff managed the body's needs, the hygiene, the medical monitoring, the physical maintenance that a body of this scale required, and that the body's inability to manage itself demanded. The staff's relationship with the Baron was defined by this proximity. They were not simply employees managing a household. They were the people who saw the Baron in the condition that the political landscape did not see, who managed the physical reality that the political presentation concealed, who knew what the body was like when the body was not being managed for effect. This knowledge gave them a different relationship with the Baron than the political visitors had, a relationship that was simultaneously more intimate and more vulnerable, because the intimacy of the knowledge made the vulnerability of the position more acute. The Baron did not treat the staff well. The Harkonnen governance style, the treatment of people as instruments, extended to the household's most intimate dimensions. The staff served because the alternative to service was worse, not because the service was rewarded with the kind of regard that the Atreides household's culture provided to its retainers. The Atreides tradition said the servant's loyalty was earned. The Harkonnen tradition said the servant's compliance was compelled. The difference was visible in the quality of the service and in the quality of the relationship between the served and the serving. The medical staff who attended the Baron's condition occupied a different position. They were managing a medical problem that the body's condition continuously generated, and the management required capabilities that the household's ordinary staff did not possess. The physicians, the medical technicians, the specialists who monitored the metabolic dysfunction and managed its symptoms, these were the people who understood at the technical level what the body was doing and what the body's condition was producing. The physicians could not fix the condition. This was the frustration that the medical staff operated under continuously. The awareness that the body's dysfunction was proceeding, that the symptoms were accumulating, that the medical monitoring could document the progression but could not reverse it. The Bene Gesserit's alteration was below the level that the medical technology could reach, and the technology's inability to reach it meant that the physician's role was management rather than cure, the mitigation of symptoms, the support of the body's functioning within the constraints that dysfunction imposed, the ongoing assessment of a condition that was not improving and that the medical staff could not make improve. The Baron's relationship with his medical staff was characterized by the same instrumentalist approach that characterized all of the Baron's relationships. The physicians were tools. Their function was the management of the body. Their value was their capability for the management. Their continued participation in the household was contingent on their utility. The physicians who produced results, who managed the symptoms effectively, who maintained the body's functioning within the constraints the dysfunction imposed, continued to serve. The physicians who did not produce results were replaced. The replacement was not always gentle. The Baron's frustration with the body's condition was a persistent feature of his emotional landscape, and the frustration found expression in the treatment of the people who were responsible for managing the condition. The physicians who failed, who could not identify the cause, who could not reverse the progression, who could not provide the improvement that the Baron's expectations demanded, experienced the Baron's frustration in ways that the Harkonnen governance style made available. The treatment was not kind. The Baron's appearance in the adaptations, the visual representations of the character in the films that Denis Villeneuve produced, and in the earlier David Lynch version, has shaped the popular understanding of the character in ways that are worth examining, because the visual representations both clarified and distorted what the texts described. The visual representations amplified the grotesqueness. This was inevitable. The visual medium required the body to be shown, and showing the body required the production design to make choices about what the body looked like that the text's verbal descriptions left partly to the reader's imagination. The films showed the body. The body was enormous, was pale, was marked by the disease's effects in ways that the production design chose to represent with attention to the body's horror-inducing potential. The amplification served the film's narrative purposes. The visual grotesqueness established the Baron as a figure of menace and revulsion that the film's visual storytelling could use to position the character within the narrative's moral framework. The viewer saw the body and understood, through the visual communication that the film medium employed, that the person inside the body was the antagonist, the figure whose opposition to the protagonist constituted the narrative's conflict. The distortion was in the simplification. The visual medium's communication was immediate. The body appeared on screen, and the viewer's response was formed in the moment of the appearance, without the time for the consideration that the text's verbal description provided. The texts could describe the body's condition and its causation and its political management and the Baron's response to it across pages of sustained narrative attention. The film could show the body for seconds, and the viewer's assessment was formed. The simplification reduced the Baron from a character to a body. The film's visual emphasis on the grotesqueness, the production design's choices about lighting and movement, and the physical presentation of the body made the body the thing the viewer remembered about the Baron, rather than the mind, or the strategy, or the political capability that the body contained. The Baron became, in the popular understanding that the films produced, the fat villain. The grotesque body that signalled villainy through its appearance, the character whose physical condition was the character's defining feature. The texts were more nuanced than this. The Baron of Herbert's novels was a mind first and a body second, a strategic intelligence whose physical condition was a complication rather than a definition, whose capabilities exceeded what the body's condition would have suggested to an observer who assessed the capability by the body's appearance. The text's Baron was dangerous because of what he thought, not because of what he looked like. The film's Baron was threatening because of what he looked like, and the thinking that made him dangerous was secondary to the visual impact of the grotesqueness. This is not a criticism of the films. The visual medium has its own requirements, and the production design's choices served those requirements effectively. It is an observation about how the medium shapes the character, and about what is lost when the character is translated from a medium that allows sustained analytical attention to a medium that operates through immediate visual impact. The Baron of the texts was more interesting than the Baron of the films, because the Baron of the texts was a person inhabiting a body rather than a body containing a person. The distinction matters for the character's moral complexity and for the thematic argument that the character embodies. The thematic architecture of the Baron's body extends through the saga in ways that connect the body to the deepest arguments the novels make about the relationship between the physical and the political, between the body and the power, between what a person is and what a person does. The Baron's body was a failed body. This is the baseline description. The body did not do what bodies were supposed to do, did not support the person it contained in the ways that the human body was designed to support the consciousness it housed. The failure was not natural. It was imposed, was the product of violence, was the consequence of an act whose consequences the Baron had not anticipated and could not reverse. The Baron's response to the failure was not acceptance. It was compensation, the deployment of every resource available to him, from the suspensor belt to the political apparatus to the demonstrations of power that the cruelty represented, in the service of overcoming the limitation that the body's failure imposed. The Baron would not be diminished by the body. The Baron would make the body's failure irrelevant through the sufficiency of the mind and the resources the mind controlled. This response was characteristic of the Harkonnen approach to every dimension of governance, the substitution of power for capability, the deployment of resources to compensate for limitations, the refusal to accept that any condition was permanent if sufficient force could be brought to bear against it. The Baron could not stand. The suspensor belt stood for him. The Baron could not project physical authority. The cruelty projected it for him. The Baron could not present the body that the Landsraad's culture valued. The intelligence and the wealth and the strategic capability presented themselves instead. The substitution worked. This is the uncomfortable truth that the Baron's story demonstrates. Power can compensate for the body. The resources that the Baron controlled, the wealth, the intelligence apparatus, the military capability, the political network, were sufficient to overcome the limitation that the body's failure imposed. The Baron was as effective from the suspensor belt as most rulers were from their thrones. The body's failure did not produce political failure. The mind's capability, supported by the resources the mind controlled, was sufficient, but the substitution was also the trap. The Baron's deployment of power to compensate for the body's failure created a dependency, a need for the power that exceeded what the power's political functions required, because the power was performing double duty, governing the Harkonnen territories and compensating for the Baron's physical condition. The Baron needed the power not just for political purposes, but for personal ones. Needed the demonstrations of authority not just to maintain his political position, but to maintain his psychological relationship with the body that the disease had given him. This double dependency, political and personal, made the Baron more invested in the accumulation and maintenance of power than a ruler with a functioning body would have been. The Atreides Duke could lose a political contest and retain his physical dignity, could return to Caladan diminished politically but undiminished physically. Still the man his body presented, still capable of the physical authority that his bearing communicated. The Baron could not lose a political contest without the loss reverberating through the personal dimension as well, because the political power that the contest threatened was also the personal power that the body's condition required. Every political threat was also a threat to the compensatory apparatus that the Baron's psychological relationship with his body depended on. This is the argument about power and the body that the Baron's story makes. Power that compensates for physical limitation becomes more precious and more desperately held than power that supplements physical capability. The Baron was more ruthless than his political situation required, more aggressive in his accumulation and defense of power than the Harkonnen house's institutional interests demanded. because the power was performing a function beyond the political, was maintaining the Baron's capacity to exist in the world despite the body's failure, was providing the psychological support that the body's condition denied. The disease made the Baron more dangerous, not less. Not because the disease gave him capabilities he wouldn't otherwise have had. The strategic intelligence was there before the disease, and the political capability was there before the disease, because the disease gave him a need that the power was required to fill, and the need made the power's acquisition and maintenance a matter of personal survival rather than simply political ambition. A ruler who wants power is dangerous. A ruler who needs power, who depends on the power for the maintenance of the psychological conditions that the body's failure has compromised, is more dangerous still. The Baron's disease did not make him less effective. It made him less constrained, because the constraints that a secure consciousness accepts. The limits on the exercise of power that a person whose body provides adequate psychological support can tolerate were not available to a consciousness whose body was a source of constant, visible, publicly demonstrated failure. The Baron's cruelty was not the cruelty of a person who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake, though the enjoyment was present. It was the cruelty of a person who needed to demonstrate power, because the body's condition made the demonstration necessary for the maintenance of the psychological conditions that the person required in order to function. The cruelty was compensatory. The compensation was for the disease. The disease was the Bene Gesserit's weapon, and the weapon's damage extended far beyond the body it was deployed against, extended to every person the Baron's need for compensatory power was exercised upon, every population the Baron's governance exploited, every political relationship the Baron's aggression destabilized. Mohiam's weapon did not simply damage the Baron, it damaged everyone the Baron's damage made the Baron damage. The weapon's blast radius included the entire political landscape that the Baron's compensatory power was exercised within. The final accounting of the Baron's body is the accounting that connects the body to every dimension of the saga's argument about embodiment, power, and the relationship between what a person is and what a person does. The body was a punishment given by Mohiam in response to the Baron's violence through the Bene Gesserit's biological capability. The punishment was lifelong, progressive, irreversible, the most sustained form of physical punishment that any character in the saga experienced. The body was a weapon, used by the Baron in service of his political objectives, through the deliberate deployment of the body's grotesqueness as a tool of intimidation and political management. The weapon was effective, the body's condition contributed to the fear that the Baron cultivated as a political tool, and the fear served the Baron's governance. The body was a vessel, carrying the genetics that the Bene Gesserit's breeding program valued, the intelligence, the strategic capability, the cognitive quality that the program incorporated into the genetic lines it was managing. The vessel was grotesque, and the genetics it carried were the same genetics that would produce the most consequential consciousnesses in human history. The body was a prison, containing the consciousness that had been the Baron's for decades, the intelligence, the appetites, the political understanding, the strategic capability, inside a physical form that could not express any of these qualities through the ordinary mechanisms of physical action. The prison was managed through the suspensor belt and the political apparatus, but the management was compensation rather than escape. The body was a legacy. The genetics it carried continued beyond the body's destruction, continued through Jessica and Paul and the twins and the God Emperor, through the breeding program's management and the Golden Path's genetic project, through the accumulated heritage that the Bene Gesserit's 90-generation project had produced from the raw material the Baron's genetics provided. The body was, finally, a story. The story of what happens when violence produces violence, when punishment produces compensation, when compensation produces aggression, when aggression produces political consequence, when political consequence reverberates through the lives of everyone the aggression touches. The Baron's body was the starting point of a cascade. From Mohaim's retaliation, through the Baron's compensatory cruelty, through the political landscape's accommodation of that cruelty, through the population's suffering under the governance the cruelty produced. The cascade began with a body. Not a grand political event, not a military campaign, not a cosmic prophecy. A body that had been changed by violence, that responded to the change with more violence, that produced through the response a pattern of consequence that extended across decades and worlds and billions of lives. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. 200 kilograms. Suspensor belt, floating through the corridors of power in a body that could not stand on its own. The most dangerous mind in the Imperium, in the most compromised body. The body did not diminish the mind did not redeem the body. Both were there, the capability and the grotesqueness, the intelligence and the flesh, the strategy and the disease, inhabiting the same space, producing the same political consequences, carried by the same suspensor belt through the same corridors of power. The body was horrifying. Not because it was large, though it was, not because it was grotesque, though it was, because it demonstrated with the sustained clarity that only the most consequential examples can provide what happens when the human body becomes a battleground. When the body is the site of violence and the response to violence and the consequence of violence. When the flesh carries the marks of the political and the personal and the institutional. When the thing the person inhabits becomes the thing the person is fighting against and fighting with and fighting through simultaneously. The Baron's body was the most comprehensive embodiment of consequence in the Dune saga. Every mark on it, every kilogram of the disease produced mass, every adjustment of the suspensor belt's settings, every hover and drift and float that replaced the walking and standing that the body could no longer do, was a consequence of the assault, of the retaliation, of the compensatory response, of the decades of governance that the compensatory response shaped. The body was the consequence made flesh, and the flesh carried in its genetics the future of the human species. The most horrifying truth about the Baron Harkonnen's body was not what the body looked like. It was what the body contained. The genetics that would produce the Kwisatz Haderach, the God Emperor, the Golden Path, the scattering. The most consequential biological heritage in human history carried in the most compromised physical form. The grotesque vessel. The precious cargo. The Baron's body. The Baron's place in the literature of villainy is unusual because the Baron occupies a position that most literary villains do not. The villain whose physical condition is simultaneously a punishment for something the villain did and a contributing cause of the further villainy the villain commits. Most literary villains who are physically marked, who carry visible evidence of their nature in their body's condition, are marked by the narrative rather than by the plot. Their physical condition is the author's decision to signal the character's moral status through visual shorthand, a decision that operates at the level of narrative convention rather than at the level of in-story causation. The villain's scar or deformity or unusual appearance is there because the author put it there to communicate something to the reader, not because the story's internal logic produced it through a chain of cause and effect that the narrative documents. The Baron's body was different. The body's condition was produced by the story's internal logic, was the consequence of a chain of events that the narrative documented with precision. The Bene Gesserit's management of the Harkonnen genetic line, the arrangement that placed Mahayim in the Baron's proximity, the Baron's assault, Mahayim's retaliation, the progressive accumulation of the retaliation's effects over years of the Baron's subsequent life. The body was not the author's shorthand. It was the story's product. This distinction elevated the Baron from a character type to a character, from the generic fat villain that literary convention recognized to a person whose physical condition had a history and a causation and a set of consequences that the narrative treated with the attention that a history and a causation and a set of consequences deserved. The Baron's body told a story. Not simply the story the body communicated through its visual impact, the story of grotesqueness and menace that the body's appearance projected, the story of violence and response and consequence that the body's condition encoded. Herbert was doing something with the Baron that science fiction's treatment of villains had not typically attempted, using the villain's body as a narrative mechanism rather than as a narrative signal. The body was not simply telling the reader that the Baron was bad. The body was telling the reader what had happened to the Baron, what the consequences of the happening had been, what the consequences of the consequences had been. The body was a chapter of the story, not a label on the character. The comparison between the Baron's embodiment and other characters' embodiment across the saga extends beyond the Litoto comparison, and encompasses several additional cases that illuminate the saga's sustained argument about the relationship between the body and the self. Paul's blindness, inflicted by the stone burner in Dune Messiah, was another case of a body altered by violence, another instance of a consciousness that had been operating at the highest levels of capability, finding itself housed in a body that could no longer support those capabilities in the ordinary way. Paul's response to the blindness was different from the Baron's response to the disease. Paul navigated the blindness through his prescient faculty, using the vision of the probable future to replace the vision of the present that the stone burner had destroyed. The navigation was impressive. Paul could walk, could interact, could govern with a functional effectiveness that the blindness should have prevented, but it was also a form of the same substitution that the Baron had employed, the use of an alternative capability to compensate for the body's failure. The difference was in the duration and the finality. Paul's blindness was followed by his desert walk, his departure from the political landscape, his acceptance of the Fremen tradition that required the blind to walk into the desert. Paul did not spend decades managing the blindness through compensatory mechanisms the way the Baron spent decades managing the disease through the suspensor belt and the political apparatus. Paul accepted the body's condition as the signal to depart, took the blindness as the indication that his time in the role was ending, that the body's inability to support the role's requirements was the sign that the role should be relinquished. The Baron could not have adopted this response. The Baron's disease was not a signal to depart. It was a condition to be managed, a limitation to be compensated for, a challenge to be overcome through the deployment of resources that the Harkonnen political operation could provide. The Baron did not understand the body's failure as a signal. He understood it as an injury, an act of violence that had been done to him, and that the response to would be the same response the Baron gave to every act of violence: more power, more control, more aggressive assertion of the authority that the body's condition seemed to challenge. Duncan Idaho's embodiment was yet another case, not a single body altered by violence, but a series of bodies, each one grown from the same genetic material, each one carrying the potential for the original personality's recovery, each one encountering the world from the position of a consciousness that had been through death and rebirth and that was assessing, with each rebirth, whether the world it had been reborn into was one worth serving. Duncan's relationship with his body was the relationship of a consciousness that had learned through repeated experience that the body was not the self, that the self could survive the body's destruction and could be recovered in a new body, that the continuity of the self was carried in something other than the flesh. Duncan's bodies were instruments, not in the Baron's sense of being tools for the exercise of power, but in the philosophical sense of being vehicles for a consciousness whose identity was independent of the vehicle it was travelling in. The Baron had no such philosophical distance from his body. The Baron's self was thoroughly identified with the body. The body's condition was experienced as the self's condition. The body's failure was experienced as the self's diminishment. The body's grotesqueness was experienced as a personal affront rather than as a condition of the vehicle the self happened to be travelling in. The identification of self with body, the inability to separate the consciousness's assessment of what it was from the body's condition, was part of what made the Baron's response to the disease so aggressive. The disease was not happening to the Baron's vehicle. The disease was happening to the Baron. The Harkonnen house culture that the Baron's body existed within was itself organized around principles of embodiment that the Baron's condition both exemplified and complicated. The Harkonnen tradition valued the body as an instrument of power. Not the body in the Atreides sense, not the body as the expression of the person's dignity, not the body as the vehicle of the person's honor. Not the body as the thing that deserved respect because the person it housed deserved respect. The body as a tool, the body as a mechanism for the exercise of authority, for the projection of force, for the physical assertion of dominance that the Harkonnen governance style used as its primary communication of who was in charge and who was not. Raban's body was the purest expression of this principle. Glossu Raban, the beast, the Baron's instrument of direct governance on Arrakis, had a body that was organized entirely around the function it served, large, powerful, intimidating, built for the physical assertion of authority that Raban's governance role required. Raban's body communicated what Raban was, a blunt instrument, a tool for the application of force, a physical presence that said to everyone who encountered it that the authority it represented was backed by the capacity for violence that the body embodied. Feyd-Rauther's body served a different function, the display function, the advertisement function, the communication to the political audience that the Harkonnen genetic line produced physical excellence as well as political capability. Feyd's body was the show model, the body that appeared in the arena, that fought the opponents the Baron's management selected, that demonstrated to the Imperium's political audience that the Harkonnen future would be represented by beauty and capability rather than by the uncle's grotesqueness. The Baron's body was neither of these things. It was not the tool body that Raban's was. The Baron could not physically assert authority, could not project force through physical presence, could not do the things that the Harkonnen tradition's body as instrument principle required. It was not the display body that Feyd's was. The Baron could not advertise the Harkonnen genetic potential through his own physical presentation, could not serve as the visible evidence of the house's biological quality. The Baron's body was the exception that proved the rule, the demonstration that the Harkonnen tradition's body as instrument principle had a failure mode, that the instrument could break, that the broken instrument required a different kind of management from the functioning one. The Baron's management of the broken instrument, the suspensor belt, the political compensation, the deployment of other people's bodies as substitutes for the functions his own body could not perform, was the adaptation that the principal's failure mode required. The adaptation was characteristic of the Baron's intelligence. A lesser mind would have been trapped by the principal, would have understood the body's failure as the disqualification from leadership that the body as instrument principle seemed to imply, would have concluded that a leader whose body could not perform the instrument's functions was not qualified to lead. The Baron's mind rejected this conclusion. The body was broken. The mind was not. The mind would manage the breakage through whatever means were available, and the management would be so effective that the breakage's impact on the leadership was minimized to the point of political irrelevance. The Baron's spice consumption is a dimension of his embodiment that the texts address briefly, but that the larger context of the spice economy illuminates. The Baron consumed spice. All of the Imperium's upper social strata consumed spice, the melange's longevity extending and perception-enhancing properties made it the most sought-after substance in the known universe, and the wealth of the noble houses ensured that the consumption was sustained at levels that produced the cumulative effects the spice was valued for. The Baron's consumption was no different in kind from any other Landsraad nobles. The spice was consumed as part of the diet, was present in the food and drink of the Harkonnen household, was as ordinary a part of the Baron's daily intake as any other dietary staple. But the Baron's relationship with the spice was complicated by the Arrakis connection. The Harkonnen house's primary source of wealth was the spice, the melange harvested from the deserts of Arrakis, managed through the Chome framework, sold to the markets of the Imperium at prices that reflected the substance's value and the operation's scale. The Baron was, through the governance of Arrakis, the manager of the substance that was simultaneously his dietary intake and his economic foundation. The 80 years of Harkonnen governance on Arrakis, the decades during which the Baron and his predecessors had managed the spice operation, had produced a relationship with the planet and its ecology that was characterized by the same instrumentalist approach that the Baron brought to every other dimension of his governance. The planet was a resource. The ecology was a production system. The spice was a product. The Fremen were a nuisance. The entire relationship was organized around the extraction of value, with no regard for the sustainability of the extraction or the well-being of the populations and ecologies that the extraction affected. The Baron's body consumed what the Baron's governance extracted. The spice that extended the Baron's life and enhanced the Baron's perception was the spice that the Harkonnen operation pulled from the deserts of Arrakis through the labour and the suffering of the populations that the Harkonnen governance exploited. The body's consumption was the personal expression of the institutional extraction. The individual instance of the pattern that the House's governance reproduced at the planetary scale. The Fremen, the people whose world the Baron's governance exploited, and whose military capability the Baron's intelligence apparatus consistently underestimated, were the people who would eventually destroy the Baron's political position, and whose representative would end the Baron's life. The connection between the exploitation and the destruction was not coincidental. The Baron's treatment of the Fremen, the dismissal, the underestimation, the governance that treated them as a nuisance rather than as a civilization, was the same instrumentalist approach that the Baron brought to every other dimension of his management, and the failure of the approach was as complete with the Fremen as the approach's successes were with the political landscape the Baron more fully understood. The Baron's death scene, the moment of the Gom Jabbar, the child's hand, the poison entering the flesh that the suspensor belt supported, deserves one final examination, because the scene encapsulates the saga's treatment of the body's significance in its most compressed form. The Baron was floating. The body that had been the subject of 200 kilograms of accumulated disease, decades of medical management, years of political compensation, the entire apparatus of the suspensor belt and the Harkonnen governance style, this body was floating in the room where the Imperium's political settlement was being negotiated. The body was there. The body was being what the body had been for decades, the grotesque, suspended, hovering physical reality that preceded every encounter with the mind it contained. Elia approached. The child whose genetics carried the Baron's own genetic material, whose body was the product of the same bloodline the Baron's body had produced, refined through the Bene Gesserit's management and expressed in a form that was the antithesis of the Baron's grotesqueness. Elia was small, was young, was carrying in her preborn consciousness the entire ancestral record that included the Baron's own life among its entries. The Gom-Jabbar was tiny, a needle, a small, precise, carefully designed instrument of death that was the opposite of the body it was being applied to. The body was enormous, was gross in the physical sense of the word, was the most visible thing in any room it occupied. The weapon was invisible, was concealable, was designed to be undetectable until the moment of its application. The needle entered the flesh, the poison acted. The body remained floating, the suspensor belt did not distinguish between a living body and a dead one, did not release the gravitational support when the life it was supporting ended. The Baron died in the air, hovering, the body maintaining its suspended position as the consciousness that had managed the body's political deployment for decades ceased to function. The death was the body's final statement. The body that had been the Baron's burden, and the Baron's weapon, and the Baron's prison, and the Baron's political instrument, this body continued to hover after the Baron was gone from it. The suspensor belt held the flesh in the air. The flesh floated. The emptiness of the floating, the grotesque mass with no one inside it, the political instrument with no one to wield it, the prison with no prisoner, was the final image of the Baron's embodied existence. The body that had been everything had been the source of the Baron's aggression, the medium of his political presentation, the motivation for his compensatory cruelty, the vessel for the genetics that would shape the species' future, was in the moment after death. Nothing, flesh and belt and gravity nullification, with the thing that had made the body significant, the mind, the will, the strategic intelligence that had made 200 kilograms of disease produced mass into one of the most feared presences in the known universe. Gone. The body remained. The person was gone. And the genetics, the thing the body contained that was more consequential than the body itself, the thing the Bene Gesserit had valued and managed and incorporated into the breeding program's lines, the genetics continued. In Jessica's blood. In Paul's capabilities. In the twins' preborn consciousness. In the God Emperor's 3,500-year reign, in the scattering's dispersal of the Atreides line across the uncharted dark. The Baron's body was the most temporary and the most permanent thing about him simultaneously. The flesh lasted decades and ended in a needle's prick. The genetics lasted millennia and shaped the species' future. The grotesque vessel carried the precious cargo for as long as the vessel held together. Then the vessel was empty, and the cargo had already been delivered. To Jessica, to Paul, to the twins, to the God Emperor, to the species, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, the body that could not stand, the mind that could not be stopped, the genetics that could not be contained by either. The horrifying truth about the Baron's body was all of it, the disease and the response, the punishment and the weaponization, the grotesqueness and the genetics, the flesh that failed and the bloodline that endured. The body was the truth. The truth was horrifying, and the horror, like everything else about the Baron, was more complicated than it appeared. The Baron's management of Arrakis, the 80 years of Harkonnen governance that preceded the Atreides transfer, was the largest scale expression of the body as instrument philosophy that the Harkonnen house had developed. And examining it reveals the relationship between the Baron's personal embodiment and his governance philosophy in its most consequential form. Arrakis was, in the Baron's management, a body to be exploited. The planet's ecology, the sandworm cycle, the spice production, the desert conditions that the ecology required, was a system to be used rather than a system to be maintained. The extraction was calibrated to the short-term revenue maximization that the Baron's economic strategy required, with the long-term sustainability of the ecology as a secondary consideration when it was considered at all. The Fremen were the population that the exploitation most directly affected, and the Baron's treatment of them was characteristic. The Fremen were not, in the Baron's assessment, a civilization. They were a labour pool and a security nuisance, a population that the governance had to manage for the spice operations functioning, but that the governance did not need to accommodate or respect. The Harkonnen intelligence apparatus assessed the Fremen's capabilities through the lens of the nuisance they represented to the spice operations logistics, and the assessment consistently underestimated what the Fremen actually were. The underestimation was a product of the Baron's governance philosophy applied to the population assessment. The Baron assessed people as instruments, evaluated them for their utility to the objectives the governance was pursuing. The Fremen's utility to the spice operation was negative. They disrupted the harvesting. They consumed resources that the operation could have allocated to production. They represented a security cost that the operations budget had to absorb. The assessment that followed from this evaluation was that the Fremen were a problem to be managed rather than a capability to be understood. The assessment was catastrophically wrong. The Fremen were not a nuisance population. They were a civilization of millions whose military capability, ecological knowledge, and cultural resilience exceeded what any population the Imperium had produced in comparable conditions. The underestimation of the Fremen was the Baron's most consequential intelligence failure, the failure that made the victory at Arrakis possible by leaving the Harkonnen forces unprepared for the scale and the capability of the Fremen military response. The failure was a body philosophy failure. The Baron's governance treated populations the way it treated bodies, as instruments whose value was determined by their utility to the governor's objectives. A body that was useful was maintained. A body that was not useful was discarded or ignored. The Fremen were assessed as not useful and were therefore not examined with the attention that a useful assessment would have received. The assessment's inadequacy was the direct consequence of the governance philosophy's limitation, the limitation of a framework that could only see utility and that missed everything that utility's narrow lens could not encompass. Peter de Vries, the Harkonnen mentat whose twisted brilliance served the Baron's intelligence operation, deserves examination in the context of the body discussion because de Vries's body was the mirror of the Baron's, a body whose condition was shaped by the demands of the function it served and whose condition reflected back on the person inhabiting it. De Vries was a mentat. The mentat training, the human-computer discipline that had been developed in the post-Butlerian Jihad era as the biological replacement for the thinking machine's computational capability, required sustained cognitive effort that the body supported through biochemical enhancement. The sapho juice that mentats consumed, the substance that enhanced the cognitive processing that the mentat function required, produced visible physical effects, the staining of the lips, the alteration of the metabolic state, the physiological signatures that the sustained cognitive enhancement left on the body. De Vries's body bore these marks. The lips were stained, the physiology was altered. The body was, in its visible condition, evidence of the demands that the mental function placed on the biological system that supported it. De Vries's body was as shaped by its function as the Baron's body was shaped by its disease. Both bodies were the products of what had been done to them. Both bodies communicated through their visible conditions something about the forces that had made them what they were. The parallel extended to the psychological dimension. De Vries's cognitive capability, the mentat processing, the analytical brilliance, the capacity for the kind of strategic assessment that the Baron's political operation required, was enhanced by the sappho juice. And the enhancement produced side effects that included the sadistic appetites that the texts document. The appetites were not inherent in De Vries's personality, they were side effects of the cognitive enhancement, produced by the same biochemical intervention that produced the analytical capability. The person and the function were entangled, the thing that made De Vries valuable. The mentat processing was the same thing that made De Vries unstable, and the instability was the price the function extracted from the body that supported it. The Baron managed De Vries's instability the same way he managed every other resource in his political operation, instrumentally. The instability was a cost that the capability justified. The sadistic appetites were contained within limits that the Baron's governance could accommodate. The person was managed as a tool, used for the function, maintained for the function's continuation, tolerated in the function's side effects because the function's value exceeded the side effect's cost. De Vries died in the poison gas deployment that Leto's tooth weapon produced, died in the room where the Baron survived, killed by the same weapon that the Baron's positioning in the suspensor belt allowed the Baron to escape. The mentat's body, sitting closer to the source of the gas than the Baron's hovering body, absorbed a lethal concentration of the compound, and the analytical mind that the sappho juice had enhanced and the sadistic appetites that the enhancement had produced both ended in the same chemical moment. The Baron's survival and De Vries's death in the same instant was a demonstration of the relationship between the body's position and the body's fate. The Baron survived not because the Baron was more resistant to the poison, but because the Baron's body was in a different position, hovering in the suspensor belt rather than sitting at the table, positioned above the gas's concentration rather than within it. The suspensor belt, which was the technology the Baron used to manage the disease's physical consequences, was also the technology that saved the Baron's life in the encounter with Leto's final weapon. The body's condition saved the body. The disease that had made the suspensor belt necessary had, through the belt's positioning of the body above the gas's lethal concentration, preserved the life that the disease had been progressively degrading. The irony was complete. The Bene Gesserit's weapon, the disease that had made the body what it was, had indirectly saved the body from the Atreides weapon through the chain of consequence that ran from the disease to the belt to the positioning to the survival. The Harkonnen military culture's relationship with embodiment extended the Baron's personal body philosophy to the institutional level and produced the specific military character that the Harkonnen forces brought to the Arrakis operation and to the battle for Arrakeen. The Harkonnen soldiers were managed as instruments. This was not unique to the Harkonnens. All military forces were, to some degree, managed instrumentally, their bodies deployed in service of objectives that the commanding authority determined. But the Harkonnen military culture carried the instrumentalism further than most. The soldiers were not cultivated, they were not developed. They were not treated as people whose capabilities were being refined through training toward the highest expression of what military service could produce. They were treated as units, as bodies deployed in configurations that the tactical situation required, replaceable when the deployment consumed them, valued for the function they performed rather than for the people they were. The Sardaukar, the Emperor's military force, whose participation in the Arrakis conspiracy was the military dimension that made the Atreides' destruction possible, were different. The Sardaukar's military capability was produced through the most demanding training conditions the Imperium maintained, the prison planet conditions of Salusa Secundus, where the environmental harshness functioned as a training filter that eliminated the incapable and refined the capable into the most formidable individual soldiers the conventional Imperium had produced. The Sardaukar were instruments too, in the military sense, but they were refined instruments, instruments whose capability was the product of the most intensive investment in the individual soldier's development that any military tradition maintained. The Fremen exceeded both. The desert's training conditions, the environmental demands of Arrakis, the culture of water discipline and survival that the Fremen tradition had developed across millennia of desert existence, produced soldiers whose individual capability and collective coordination exceeded what either the Harkonnen forces or the Sardaukar could match. The Fremen were not instruments in any institutional sense. They were members of a civilization whose military capability was the organic expression of their culture rather than the institutional product of a training program. The battle for Arrakeen demonstrated the consequences of these different relationships with the soldier's body. The Harkonnen forces, managed instrumentally, deployed without the individual investment that would have made them more effective, were overwhelmed by the Fremen's capability. The Sardaukar, refined individually, but deployed in a context the refinement had not prepared them for, were overwhelmed as well. The Fremen, whose bodies were the products of the most demanding environmental training the Imperium's worlds had produced, prevailed. The Baron watched this happen from Arrakeen, watched the forces he had deployed, the bodies he had managed as instruments, fail against forces that were not managed instrumentally, but that were the organic expression of a civilization the Baron had never taken the trouble to understand. The Baron's intelligence failure, the underestimation of the Fremen that had left the Harkonnen planning inadequate for the Fremen response, was a body philosophy failure at the military scale, the consequence of treating bodies as instruments and being confronted by bodies that were more than instruments. The Baron's legacy, the thing the Baron left behind when the Gom Jabbar ended the consciousness that the suspensor belt had been supporting, was the absence that his removal produced in the political landscape. The Harkonnen political operation, the intelligence network, the military capability, the economic infrastructure, the governance apparatus did not survive the Baron's death. Not because the operation depended on the Baron's personal involvement in every dimension of its functioning. The apparatus had managers, had operational leadership, had the institutional capability to continue functioning without the Baron's direct management. Because the apparatus was organized around the Baron's mind, was shaped by the Baron's strategic thinking, was calibrated to the Baron's assessment of the political landscape and the Baron's judgment about how the landscape should be navigated. The removal of the mind that the apparatus was organized around was the removal of the organizing principle. Without the Baron's strategic thinking, the apparatus could continue operating, the agents could gather intelligence, the military could deploy forces, the economic infrastructure could generate revenue. But the operating was without direction. Without the strategic assessment that the Baron's mind had provided, without the judgment that had calibrated the apparatus's outputs to the political landscape's requirements, without the intelligence that had made the apparatus effective rather than simply busy. The body's death was the mind's death, was the apparatus's death. The chain of consequence ran from the Gom Jabbar through the poison to the consciousness to the institutional apparatus that the consciousness had directed. The Baron's most consequential legacy was not what he built, but what his removal destroyed. The intelligence network that no successor could operate with the Baron's precision. The political relationships that no successor understood with the Baron's depth. The strategic positioning that no successor could maintain with the Baron's capability. Fade Rother, the heir the Baron had been grooming to succeed him, was dead. Paul had killed him in single combat. The beautiful body that had been the Harkonnen future destroyed by the same Atreides heir whose survival the Harkonnen conspiracy had been designed to prevent. Raban was dead. The Fremen had killed him, the blunt instrument broken by the forces it had been deployed against. The Baron's body was dead. The nephews' bodies were dead. The house was finished. And the genetics lived on. In the Atreides line, through Jessica, through Paul, through the twins, through every descendant that the bloodline's continuation would produce across the millennia that followed. The body was gone. The body had been gone for minutes, for years, for centuries, for millennia. The genetics endured. The Baron would have hated this. The man whose entire life had been organized around the accumulation and maintenance of Harkonnen power would have hated the knowledge that his most enduring legacy was not the Harkonnen house, which was destroyed, but the Atreides line, which the Baron had spent his career trying to destroy, and which was carrying his genetics into the most consequential future the species would produce. The final irony of the Baron's body was the irony of the genetics. The body that could not stand under its own power contained the genetic material that would eventually produce the being who stood above the entire species for 3,500 years. The grotesque flesh carried the blueprint for the God Emperor. The disease-ridden mass contained the code that the Bene Gesserit's breeding program had valued above every other consideration. Valued above the morality of the person the genetics inhabited, valued above the character that the genetics expression in the living Baron had produced, valued for the cognitive quality that the genetics encoded and that the breeding program's management would eventually combine with other lines' contributions to produce the Kwisatz Haderach and the God Emperor and the Golden Path. The body was the container, the genetics were the content. The container was horrifying. The content was the most valuable biological material in human history. The horrifying truth about the Baron Harkonnen's body was not any single dimension of its condition. Not the disease alone, not the suspensor belt alone, not the political weaponization alone, not the possession of Elia alone, not the genetic legacy alone. The horrifying truth was all of them together. The way the body's story connected the personal to the political, to the genetic to the cosmic. The way the flesh that could not stand carried the code that would shape the species. The way the grotesque exterior contained the precious interior. The way the punishment and the legacy inhabited the same 200 kilograms of suspended flesh. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. The body tells the story. The story is horrifying. The horror is more complex than the surface suggests. Beneath the horror, beneath the disease and the cruelty and the exploitation and the grotesqueness, the body carried the future. The future did not care what the container looked like. The future cared what the container contained.